Somewhere in the driest, most lifeless stretch of Central Asia, there's a desert that kills anything that enters it. No rivers, no shade. Summer temperatures that melt the soles of your shoes. Winters cold enough to crack stone. The kind of place where if you got lost you wouldn't last 3 days. And yet, buried beneath that same merciless sand, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist. Bodies. Not skeletons, not fragments. Actual human bodies, thousands of years old with skin still stretched over their bones, eyelashes still intact, clothing still wrapped around their shoulders like they'd just laid down for a nap and never gotten back up. This is the Tarim Basin, tucked into what's now northwestern China, and it's home to some of the most well-preserved mummies ever discovered anywhere on Earth. We're talking better preservation than a lot of Egyptian mummies, and these people were never intentionally embalmed. The desert did all the work. Nature turned this brutal, unforgiving wasteland into the world's most effective time capsule. But the bodies themselves aren't even the strangest part of this story. It's who these people turned out to be, or more specifically, who they weren't supposed to be. When scientists finally managed to extract usable DNA from these mummies, the results didn't match what anyone expected. Headlines exploded across the internet, claiming these people's genetic code matched no known population on Earth. A mystery population, a genetic ghost, people with no ancestors and no descendants seemingly appearing out of nowhere in the middle of Asia thousands of years ago. It sounds like the setup for a science fiction movie. Ancient humans with untraceable DNA, sitting at a crossroads of civilizations, wearing clothes that echo cultures thousands of miles away, speaking a language nobody expected to find there. And I'll be honest with you, that headline isn't exactly wrong. But it's not exactly right either. The real story, the one buried underneath the viral claims and the clickbait, is stranger, more layered, and honestly, a lot more satisfying than mystery DNA from nowhere. Because here's the thing about ancient genetics, it rarely gives you a simple answer. It gives you threads, long, tangled threads that stretch back tens of thousands of years, connecting people across continents in ways nobody could have guessed just by looking at their bones. To understand what these mummies actually tell us, we need to talk about deep ancestry, isolated populations, and a genetic lineage so old and so rare that finding it preserved almost perfectly in one small pocket of desert changed how scientists think about human migration entirely. So over the next while, we're going deep. We'll walk through how these bodies were found, what their clothing reveals about trade routes that shouldn't have existed yet, what their diet tells us about how anyone survived out there at all, and how linguists, archaeologists and geneticists have spent decades arguing about where these people actually came from. Then we'll get into the DNA itself, the real analysis, the part that made this story explode online in the first place, and why the truth is honestly more fascinating than the myth. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing these comments roll in. Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, somewhere in between. It's one of my favourite parts of making these, and if you want to actually support the channel, the best way to do it costs you nothing. Follow the show on Spotify and drop a 5-star review if you've got 30 seconds. The link's in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's head into the sand, because the story of how these bodies were even found is almost as wild as what their DNA eventually revealed. Let's talk about where this all actually happened, because the location itself is half the mystery. The Tarim Basin sits in the far northwestern corner of China, in a region called Xinjiang. If you pull up a map, you'll notice something immediately. This place is about as far from an ocean as you can get anywhere on the planet. It's landlocked in the truest sense of the word, ringed on almost every side by some of the tallest, most brutal mountain ranges on Earth. The Tian Shan Mountains close it off to the north. The Kunlun Mountains guard the south. The Pamirs rise up to the west, like a stone wall separating Central Asia from everything beyond it. This isn't just a basin, it's a bowl carved into the middle of a continent, sealed off by geography on almost every side. And inside that bowl, you've got the Taklamakan Desert. Now, deserts get thrown around casually in conversation. People call anywhere hot and dry a desert, but the Taklamakan is a different beast entirely. Locals have an old saying about this place, and it roughly translates to "go in and you won't come out." That's not a metaphor. That's a warning passed down through generations of people who watched travellers disappear into the dunes and never return. The Taklamakan is one of the largest sandy deserts on Earth, and it's also one of the driest. We're talking a place where some regions receive less rainfall in a year than a single afternoon thunderstorm in a temperate climate. Sand dunes here can reach heights of several hundred feet, shifting constantly, swallowing anything that sits still for too long. Temperatures swing to brutal extremes, scorching in summer, punishing in winter, with almost nothing in between to soften the blow. So why would anyone live here? Why would ancient people choose to settle in a place clearly designed by nature to kill them? The answer is oases, scattered around the edges of the Taklamakan, fed by snowmelt running down from those surrounding mountain ranges. Small pockets of water created green slivers of livable land. In an otherwise lethal landscape, rivers like the Tarim itself, along with smaller tributaries, carried meltwater from the peaks down into the basin, creating strips of vegetation, grazing land, and fresh water just barely wide enough to support human life. These oases became lifelines, isolated islands of green surrounded by an ocean of sand, and ancient communities didn't just pass through them. They built lives there, small scattered settlements clinging to the edges of survival, not unlike those early human populations we just talked about who spread out across the landscape in tiny isolated pockets, rather than clustering together in one vulnerable spot. It's almost poetic when you think about it. Thousands of years earlier and thousands of miles away, our ancestors survived a climate apocalypse by scattering into small, disconnected groups. And here, in this desert basin, we see a similar pattern playing out on a smaller, more localized scale. Isolated communities, spaced out along a lifeline of water, each one vulnerable, each one dependent on a fragile, unpredictable environment. If one oasis dried up, if one water source shifted or vanished, that community either moved or died. There was no room for error out here. Now, here's where things get interesting, because the same brutal conditions that made this place nearly uninhabitable are exactly what turned it into an accidental preservation machine. Think about what destroys a human body after death. Moisture, bacteria, insects, scavengers, soil acidity. In most environments on Earth, a body starts breaking down almost immediately, and within decades, sometimes even years, there's often nothing left but bone, and eventually not even that. But the Tarim Basin strips away almost every single one of those destructive forces. The air is so dry that bacteria struggle to survive, let alone thrive. There's so little moisture in the ground that decomposition, the process that normally reduces a body to dust, essentially stalls out before it can really begin. Add to that the salt content in much of the soil here, a natural preservative that's been used by humans for thousands of years to cure meat and prevent decay, and you've got a burial environment that's almost eerily good at keeping things intact. When ancient communities buried their dead in this region, sometimes in shallow graves dug into sandy saline soil, sometimes in wooden coffins covered with cattle hides, they were unknowingly creating conditions that would preserve those bodies for thousands of years. Skin, hair, eyelashes, clothing, stitching, even the felt of a hat or the wool of a garment survived, largely untouched, while entire civilizations rose and fell elsewhere in the world. It's not intentional mummification like what we associate with ancient Egypt. There's no evidence of embalming, no removal of organs, no elaborate ritual preservation process. This is nature doing the work, desiccation, salt and isolation, combining almost by accident to create some of the best preserved human remains ever discovered anywhere on the planet. But preservation is only half the story here. The other half is location. Look at where the Tarim Basin actually sits on a map of Eurasia, and you start to realize this wasn't just some random dead zone in the middle of nowhere. It was a crossroads. To the east, you've got the heartland of what would become China. To the west, the vast grasslands and mountain passes of Central Asia, gateways toward Persia, India, and eventually Europe. To the north, the steppe, home to nomadic populations who would shape the movement of people, animals, and ideas across Eurasia for thousands of years. The Tarim Basin sat almost exactly at the point where all of these worlds could potentially intersect. This is important because centuries later this exact region would become famous as one of the central arteries of the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected East Asia to the Mediterranean world, carrying silk, spices, ideas, religions and technologies across thousands of miles for well over 1,000 years. If you've heard of the Silk Road, there's a good chance you've heard of towns and oases in this very basin, places that later became bustling trade hubs where merchants, monks and travellers from wildly different cultures crossed paths. But here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. The mummies we're talking about, the ones buried in this basin with their skin and hair still intact, predate the Silk Road by thousands of years. We're not talking about people who lived during the height of Silk Road trade, when cultural exchange across Eurasia was already common and well documented. These bodies go back much further to a period when this region should have been, by most assumptions, remote, isolated and disconnected from the wider world. Long before merchants started hauling silk and spices across these deserts, someone was already living here, dying here, and being buried here, in a place seemingly cut off from everyone and everything. So we've got the perfect burial conditions, we've got a crossroads location, and we've got timing that puts these people in this desert long before the famous trade networks that would later define the region, which raises an obvious question. Who were these people, and where did they actually come from? Because when archaeologists first pulled these bodies out of the sand, that question became a lot more complicated than anyone expected. The question was hanging there in the desert. Who were these people, and where did they come from? For a long time, nobody outside a small circle of explorers, local officials, and archaeologists even knew the scale of what was buried in the Tarim Basin. The region had produced ancient ruins and grave sites before. Travellers moving around the edges of the Taklamakan had reported strange wooden structures, exposed bones, fragments of cloth, and objects emerging from the dunes. But a desert is very good at hiding its secrets until the wind decides otherwise. One season, a burial might be completely buried. The next, a shifting dune could expose a coffin, a carved post, or the edge of a human face that had not seen daylight for 4,000 years. Some of the earliest major investigations came during the turbulent expedition era of the early 20th century, when foreign and Chinese explorers were moving through Xinjiang, mapping ruins, collecting manuscripts, and documenting sites around Lop Nur. They encountered cemeteries and remains in a landscape already changing fast. Rivers shifted, lakes shrank, sand covered old routes. Entire settlements that had once depended on water were becoming part of the desert. But the mummies did not become an international mystery all at once. It happened gradually, site by site, body by body. One important area was Querighul, also spelled Gumugo, a cemetery near the old Lop Nur region in the eastern Tarim Basin. Archaeologists excavated there in the late 20th century and uncovered burials dating back roughly 4,000 years. The graves contained wooden coffins, animal remains, woven textiles, and naturally preserved human bodies. These were not kings in gold masks or aristocrats, sealed inside monumental tombs. They appeared to be members of an ancient desert community, people whose lives had depended on the fragile water systems around the basin. Then there was Xiaohe. Xiaohe means small river, which is almost painfully ironic today because the site sits in an environment where reliable water can seem like a memory. The cemetery was first recorded by the Swedish explorer and archaeologist Folke Bergman in the 1930s. What he found was unlike almost anything else known from ancient Eurasia. Rows of tall wooden poles rose from the sand above graves. Some were shaped like paddles. Others had forms that scholars have interpreted in different ways, including possible sexual symbolism connected to fertility and death. Beneath them were wooden coffins, many covered in cattle hides, containing bodies preserved by the dry, salty conditions. For decades, Xiaohe remained difficult to study in full. It was remote. The desert protected it, but it also made access difficult. Later excavations by Chinese archaeologists revealed that this was not a small, isolated burial ground. It was a major cemetery used over many generations. Hundreds of graves. Carefully organized burials, a community returning to the same sacred place again and again, leaving their dead beneath a forest of wooden markers. And then, in the Lop Nur region, came discoveries that brought this story to a much wider audience. In 1980, Chinese archaeologists excavated the remains of a woman who would become internationally famous as the Beauty of Lulan. She had died around 3,800 years ago, give or take the uncertainties that always come with ancient dating. Her body had been naturally mummified. Her features were still visible. Her hair remained. Her clothing survived. Even after nearly 4 millennia in the desert, she did not look like an abstract archaeological specimen. She looked disturbingly, powerfully human. That was the shock. Not simply that ancient bodies had survived. Archaeologists had seen mummies before. Egypt had mummies, the Andes had mummies. Frozen regions had preserved bodies for thousands of years. But these Tarim Basin remains confronted people with something unusually immediate. Intact strands of hair, brown, leathery skin pulled tight over bone, eyelashes in some cases, woolen garments, felt hats, leather footwear, faces that still seem to hold expressions, as if the dead had only recently fallen asleep beneath the sand. A skeleton creates distance. You can look at a skull and feel separated from the person who once lived inside it. But a mummy closes that distance. You see a forehead, a mouth, a braid of hair. You see clothes that someone selected, wore, repaired, and was eventually buried in. Suddenly this is not just an ancient population. It is an individual, a woman, a man, a child, someone who ate, worked, mourned, and probably worried about the same desert that eventually preserved them. And those faces started an argument almost immediately. Early observers noticed traits that they considered unfamiliar for ancient populations in what is now Western China. Some mummies appeared to have light-coloured or reddish-brown hair. Some had long noses and facial structures that, to modern eyes, seemed more similar to people from Western Eurasia than to stereotypical images of East Asian populations. Their clothing added to the impression. Wool textiles, woven patterns, leather boots, and pointed felt headgear looked, at least superficially, like objects that could fit into traditions from the Eurasian steppe or regions far to the west. So people made a leap. They looked at the bodies and concluded, Europeans, or Celts, or lost travellers from the Mediterranean. or an isolated Western colony, somehow stranded in the Chinese desert. These claims spread fast because they were dramatic, easy to repeat, and built around something people thought they understood instantly: a face. If a mummy looked European to a modern observer, then surely it must have come from Europe. Case closed, except it was not closed, not even close. The problem is that human appearance is a terrible shortcut for reconstructing deep ancestry. Hair colour can be misleading. Facial features do not come with neat continental labels. Ancient populations did not arrange themselves according to the categories modern people use today. And a body buried 4,000 years ago, dried, compressed, altered by salt, and viewed through the expectations of modern observers, is not a simple biological map. The people making those early claims were also working with incomplete information. In many cases, excavation records from the earliest finds were limited by the standards and circumstances of their time. Some sites were discovered after wind erosion had already disturbed the graves. Others had been damaged by looting or exposed for years before systematic study began. Exact locations were not always recorded with the precision archaeologists would demand today. Dating techniques improved over time. Site names shifted between languages and transliteration systems. One cemetery might appear under several spellings in different publications, making the evidence seem even more confusing than it already was. And then there was the political reality. Xinjiang is not just an archaeological region. It is a place with a complicated history, many ethnic communities, contested cultural narratives, and enormous modern political sensitivity. Questions about who lived there first, where ancient people came from, and how later populations are connected to earlier ones can become much more than academic debates. Archaeology gets pulled into identity. Genetics gets pulled into politics. A headline about a mummy can become evidence in an argument it was never capable of settling. That meant every claim carried extra weight. If the mummies were described as ancient Europeans, some people treated that as proof that the region belonged culturally to the West. If they were described as ancient ancestors of later Central Asian or East Asian peoples, others saw that as confirmation of a completely different story. But the dead themselves were not making any of these arguments. They had lived thousands of years before modern borders, modern nations, and modern ethnic labels existed. What the first unearthed faces really gave us was not an answer. They gave us a mystery powerful enough to distort the questions. Because the more carefully archaeologists studied the graves, the harder it became to fit these people into any simple box. Their bodies looked one way to early observers. Their clothing suggested connections in multiple directions. Their burial customs were unlike anything nearby. Their location sat at the edge of a desert crossroads, but their oldest graves appeared to predate the famous Silk Road by millennia, and eventually scientists found a way to ask the question without relying on faces at all. They went looking for the answer in the one place these ancient people had carried with them from birth: their DNA. But before DNA could answer where these people came from, the desert had already given archaeologists something else. Something almost as powerful and much more emotionally difficult to look at. It had given them faces. The phrase mummy can make people think of Egypt immediately. Gold masks, tomb chambers, priests wrapping bodies in linen, organs removed and stored in jars, chemical mixtures carefully applied to stop decay. That is deliberate embalming. It is a technology, a ritual process carried out by the living, designed to preserve the dead. The Tarim Basin mummies are different. There is no strong evidence that the earliest Tarim Basin communities were performing Egyptian-style embalming. Their bodies were not preserved because specialists removed organs, treated them with elaborate resins, and wrapped them according to a formal procedure. They were preserved because the desert did most of the work, and the desert was exceptionally good at it. Normally, after death, the human body begins changing almost immediately. Cells break down. Bacteria, including bacteria already living inside the body, begin consuming tissues. Moisture supports that process. Warmth can speed it up. Insects can accelerate it further. Within a surprisingly short time, the recognizable features of a person can disappear. But take away the moisture, and the entire process changes. In the Tarim Basin, bodies placed in dry graves could lose water rapidly. The arid air, sandy soil, and in some locations salty conditions pulled moisture from skin, muscles, and internal tissues before the usual cycles of decomposition could advance very far. Bacteria need water, insects need access, decay needs the right conditions. The desert denied it all three. The skin dried and tightened. Soft tissue shrank around the bones, hair survived, clothing survived, leather hardened but remained recognizable. Wool resisted decay far better than plant fibers would have in a wet grave. In some burials the dead were protected further by wooden coffins, cattle hides, or layers of fabric that helped keep the grave environment stable. It was not one magical moment. It was a race decay started trying to erase the body. The desert dried it first. That is natural mummification. No secret chemical formula, no ancient embalmers working by torchlight. Just an environment so dry that it turned death into preservation. And preservation is why the beauty of Lulan became so haunting. She was an adult woman buried in the Lopnur region nearly 4,000 years ago. Her body was not intact in the way a living body is intact. Time had changed her. Her skin had become dark and leathery. Her features had dried, narrowed, and tightened. Yet the outline of her face remained visible. Her hair remained visible. Her clothing remained. She seemed less like a distant skeleton and more like someone caught in an impossible pause. That is the unsettling power of a mummy. It creates the illusion that we are seeing the person exactly as they were. But we are not. We are seeing a body transformed by death, dehydration, burial, excavation, conservation, and thousands of years of time. A preserved face can tell us that someone had hair, but not always its exact original shade. Hair can bleach, darken, redden, or otherwise change chemically after burial. Skin can turn brown, black, yellowish, or reddish as tissues dry and interact with minerals in the soil. The nose, lips, cheeks, and eyelids shrink as moisture disappears. A narrow, dried nose may not have looked narrow in life. High cheekbones may appear sharper after the flesh collapses. Eyes are gone, so the colour people imagine is often exactly that, imagination. Even eyelashes, when they survive, can create a false sense of certainty. They make the person seem present. They make us feel that their expression is still there. But expressions do not survive 4,000 years. Faces do not survive unchanged. What survives is evidence, not a photograph. Still, the evidence can be extraordinary. Some Tarim Basin mummies were found with long hair arranged in braids. That detail matters because hair is not only biological. A braid is a choice. Someone grew it, maintained it, divided it into sections, and worked it with their hands. Perhaps the person braided their own hair. Perhaps a relative did it. Perhaps it was arranged during burial. We cannot always know. But the braid turns an ancient body into a social person again. It suggests grooming, identity, custom, and care. The hats do the same thing. Felt headgear from Tarim Basin burials has become famous because it looks so unexpectedly familiar. Some examples are tall and pointed, others are more rounded or conical. Felt is made by matting wool fibres together with moisture, pressure, and friction. It is not just an accidental material. Making it requires knowledge of animal fibers, labour and technique. A felt hat says something important about the people who made it. They had access to sheep wool or other suitable animal fibers. They understood how to process those fibers. They knew that felt could provide warmth, wind resistance and protection in an environment where the temperature could swing violently between day and night. The desert may be scorching under the sun, but it can be bitterly cold after dark. A hat was not decoration alone, it was survival equipment. Then there is the footwear. Leather boots and shoes found in these burials reveal another layer of practical skill. Leather must be cut, shaped, stitched, and maintained. It is made from animal hide, but turning a hide into wearable footwear requires tanning or other preservation methods, careful workmanship, and an understanding of how material behaves under stress. A badly made shoe rubs, splits, leaks, and fails. A good one can carry a person across rough ground for years. When archaeologists find leather footwear beside a mummy, they are not just finding an object. They are finding the endpoint of an entire chain of knowledge. Herding or hunting, skinning, hide processing, tool making, stitching, repair, travel, and woven fabrics may be the most revealing objects of all. Textiles rarely survive in most archaeological settings. In wet soils they rot. In humid climates they vanish. But in the Tarim Basin, dry conditions preserved woven woolen cloth, sometimes with patterns that still remain visible. These fabrics show that ancient communities were not simply draping themselves in raw animal skins. They were spinning fibers into thread, setting up looms, weaving cloth, and creating garments suited to their environment. That is a major technological achievement. To make woven wool, someone first has to manage animals that produce usable fleece, or obtain that wool through exchange. The fibers must be cleaned, sorted, and spun. Threads must be kept under tension. A loom must be prepared. Patterns require planning. Dyes, if present, require even more specialized knowledge. Every surviving scrap is evidence of time, practice, and inherited skill. And clothing is never just clothing. What people wear can signal climate, profession, status, community, age, ritual role, or personal taste. A hat can say, "I belong." A textile pattern can say, "My family makes things this way." A pair of boots can reveal the kind of terrain someone expected to cross. But archaeology has limits. A garment tells us what was buried with a person. It does not automatically tell us what every person in their community wore every day. Burial clothing may have been special. It may have been old. It may have been chosen by surviving relatives. The same caution applies to appearance. For decades, photographs of the Tarim mummies encouraged a particular phrase, European looking. It sounds simple. It sounds descriptive. But it carries far more certainty than the evidence can support. What does European looking even mean when applied to a person who died around 1800 BCE? Europe itself contained many different populations then, just as it does now. Central Asia contained many different populations. East Asia contained many different populations. The ancient world was not divided into modern racial categories, waiting for us to assign every face to the correct box. A mummy with reddish-brown hair, a long nose, deep-set features, or a woolen hat does not come with a label saying European. Those traits can be shaped by ancestry, yes, but also by preservation, individual variation, and the expectations of the observer. A dried face is especially dangerous evidence, because it appears so direct. We think we are simply looking. In reality, we are interpreting. And people are very good at seeing what they expect to see. To some early observers, the Tarim mummies looked Western. To others, their features seemed mixed, ambiguous, or impossible to place. That disagreement was not a failure of observation. It was a warning. Human faces do not preserve ancient population history in a neat, readable form. The clothing complicated the story even further. Wool, felt, leather, braids, and woven patterns suggested links to traditions found across the Eurasian steppe and beyond. But a cultural connection is not the same thing as a direct migration. Objects move, techniques spread, ideas travel through trade, marriage, imitation, and small networks of contact. A community can adopt a textile tradition without being descended from the people who first invented it. That distinction would become crucial because the mummies seemed to offer two stories at once. Their bodies gave people the impression of distant ancestry. Their clothes suggested broad cultural connections. Yet neither faces nor fabrics could answer the biggest question with confidence. Who were these people biologically? Who were they connected to? And how long had their ancestors been living around the Tarim Basin? For that, scientists would need DNA. But first there was another cemetery deeper in the desert, a place where the dead were laid beneath wooden boats and cattle hides, marked by poles rising from the sand like a silent forest. Xiaohe. Xiaohe means small river in Chinese, but the cemetery itself sits in one of the last places where anyone today would expect a river to matter. It rises from the desert as a long, narrow mound of sand, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Tarim Basin. No city walls, no stone temples, no written inscriptions explaining who built it or what they believed, just graves and wood. Hundreds of wooden posts once stood above the burials driven upright into the sand, until the cemetery must have looked like a strange forest rising from the dunes. From a distance perhaps it was a landmark, a place visible across the flat, pale landscape. A message to travellers, a warning, a memorial, or all three. Beneath those posts lay one of the most unusual Bronze Age burial grounds ever discovered. The cemetery was first recorded in the early 20th century by the Swedish explorer Folke Bergman, who called it Urdek's necropolis. But for decades its exact location was effectively lost beneath shifting sands and limited access to the region. When Chinese archaeologists relocated and excavated the site in the early 2000s, Xiaohe began revealing a community that had buried its dead there over many generations. The cemetery was not the work of one grieving family after one disaster. It was used repeatedly, probably from around 2000 BCE into the middle of the second millennium BCE. Layer after layer of burials accumulated in the sand. New graves were placed among old ones, posts were added. Coffins were lowered, hides were spread over the dead. Ritual objects were left behind. Over time, a burial ground became a monument, and the people buried there were not laid in ordinary wooden boxes. Many were placed inside boat-shaped coffins. Imagine the symbolism of that for a moment. In a region now defined by desert, people were buried in vessels shaped like boats. Their coffins were made from planks, curved and fitted into forms that resemble narrow watercraft. In some cases the body lay inside, and the whole structure was covered by cattle hide, stretched over the coffin like a protective skin. It is one of those discoveries that seems almost too perfectly strange. A boat in a desert, a hide-covered vessel beneath the sand. A dead person prepared, enclosed, and sent somewhere. But what that somewhere meant remains uncertain. Maybe boats preserved a memory of waterways that once shaped life around the basin. The Tarim Basin was never simply an empty sea of dunes. Rivers flowed down from the surrounding mountains. Wetlands formed around their edges. Lakes expanded and shrank as climate changed. Communities survived where water allowed them to survive. A boat-shaped coffin may have reflected a world in which rivers were essential, dangerous, sacred, or all of those things at once. Or perhaps the boat was not about literal travel on water at all. Across many ancient cultures, death is imagined as a journey. The dead cross a boundary. They move from one world into another. A coffin shaped like a vessel could have represented that passage. Not a trip down an actual river, but a voyage beyond the reach of the living. We cannot ask the people of Xiaohe what they believed. They left no writing, no prayers carved into wood, no priestly manual explaining the ritual. What they left was material evidence, carefully arranged evidence, and every burial suggests that death was not treated as random disposal. It was organized, it was repeated, it mattered. The cattle hides are especially revealing. Cattle were valuable animals. They provided meat, milk, hides, bone, labour, and possibly status. To place a large hide over a coffin was not a casual choice. It meant that someone had slaughtered, or at least acquired, an animal whose body could be turned into protection for the dead. The hide may have sealed the coffin against sand. It may have helped create the dry conditions that preserved the body. But it may also have carried ritual meaning. A hide is more than leather before it is processed. It is the skin of another living creature. It once held warmth, muscle, breath, and movement. Covering a human body in cattle hide could have symbolized protection, renewal, sacrifice, wealth, or an association between the dead and the animals that sustained the community. That interpretation is possible. It is not proven. But Xiaohe is full of choices that seem too deliberate to be purely practical. Then there are the posts. Some were shaped in ways archaeologists have often interpreted as gendered. At Xiaohe, certain upright markers are long and narrow, sometimes described as phallic in form. Others are broader, flatter, or paddle-like, sometimes linked to female symbolism. Their placement appears to have related, at least in part, to the sex of the individual buried below. If that interpretation is correct, then the cemetery was making a public statement about identity even after death. A person's body disappeared beneath sand, hide, and wood. But a marker remained above ground, announcing something about who had been buried there. Male, female, ancestor, member of a lineage, participant in a ritual order we can only partly see. But caution matters here too. Modern categories can be tempting. A pole that looks sexual to us may have had meanings that were much broader to the people who made it. Fertility, ancestry, protection, household identity, clan affiliation, birth, death, seasonal renewal. Ancient symbols can carry several meanings at once. The wooden posts may have marked gender, but they may also have connected the dead to a larger system of belief. And perhaps that is why the cemetery feels so haunting. It preserves people but not explanations. At Xiaohe, archaeologists found bodies with hair still attached to their heads, faces dried into recognizable outlines, clothing, hats, leather, woven textiles, wooden objects, baskets and offerings. Some burials included plant remains. Others contained objects that appear to have been made specifically for funerary use. The desert sealed up a fragment of Bronze Age life with a level of preservation that is almost unfair to time. Normally, archaeology deals with broken things, a few bones, a stone blade, a stain in the soil where a wooden structure once stood, a handful of pottery fragments. From those traces, researchers have to reconstruct entire worlds. At Xiaohe, the dead arrived with much more of their world still attached. Their hair, their garments, their coffins, the hides covering them, the posts that stood above them, the tools and objects placed nearby. The organic materials that would have vanished almost anywhere else. It is an extraordinary snapshot, but it is still only a snapshot. A cemetery does not show us everyone. It may overrepresent people with higher status, people who died under particular circumstances, or families who had access to this sacred location. Some members of the community may have been buried elsewhere. Some graves may have been erased by wind, looting, erosion, or earlier excavations. And what archaeologists uncover is not the entire past. It is what survived the desert's long process of selection that leaves difficult questions. Were the people buried in the same part of Xiaohe close relatives? Did certain families inherit particular burial zones? Did the most elaborate coffins belong to leaders, elders, ritual specialists, or simply people whose relatives could afford more labour and materials? Were men and women buried differently because they held different roles in life? Or did the grave markers represent something more spiritual than social? Were children given the same ceremonies as adults? Did mourners gather at the cemetery for feasts, offerings, or seasonal rituals long after a burial had taken place? And who built the boats? Not literally one person, but socially. Who cut the timber in a land where large trees were scarce? Who transported it? Who shaped the planks? Who prepared the hides? Who dug the grave? Who placed the body inside? Who raised the wooden marker and then walked away, leaving a loved one beneath the sand? Every burial required a community. That may be the most important thing Xiaohe reveals. These were not isolated individuals wandering through an empty desert. They were people bound by shared customs. They knew how to build, how to work wood and leather, how to manage animals, how to weave, how to mourn, how to repeat a ritual across generations without writing it down. Their cemetery was a kind of memory machine. Each new burial connected the living to the dead who had come before. Each post added another marker to the wooden forest. Each boat-shaped coffin placed beneath the sand made the landscape itself into an ancestral space. And yet, for all its detail, Xiaohe deepened the central mystery. The coffins suggested a complex ritual world. The textiles suggested broad cultural connections. The cattle hides pointed to herding. The preserved faces invited endless speculation. But none of it could say exactly where these people came from. A boat-shaped coffin can tell us how someone was buried. It cannot tell us whose descendants they were. For that answer, scientists would eventually have to go deeper than the coffin, deeper than the clothing, deeper than the face. They would have to look inside the bones. And the clothing was where the argument became impossible to ignore. For decades, long before anyone could recover ancient DNA from the bones, archaeologists kept returning to the same question. Why did some of these mummies appear to be dressed in textiles that looked so familiar to scholars of Bronze Age Europe? Not identical, not proof of some ancient caravan rolling across Eurasia, but familiar enough to start a global argument. The dry air of the Tarim Basin preserved materials that normally disappear almost everywhere else. Wool cloth, felted fabric, leather, fur, plant fibres, braided cords, carefully stitched boots, hats shaped from felt and decorated with feathers. These were not scraps caught by chance in the sand. In many cases, they were garments made for real bodies, worn by real people, then carried with them into death. A mummy's clothing can reveal an astonishing amount. It can tell us what animals people kept, what temperatures they endured, whether they could spin thread, weave cloth, tan hides, sew fitted garments, and make materials that resisted wind, cold, and sand. It can reveal trade, imitation, local invention, and social identity. It can also mislead us, because when archaeologists first saw some of the Tarim textiles, especially the woven wool with checks and stripes, they saw something that looked remarkably like tartan. And tartan has a powerful cultural association. Say the word, and most people picture Scotland, Highland clans, plaid kilts, medieval and early modern Europe. So when ancient mummies in far western China were found wearing fabrics with coloured bands crossing in grids, It seemed to offer an obvious answer. These people must have come from the West. Maybe they were migrants from Europe. Maybe they were descendants of steppe herders who had crossed thousands of miles. Maybe their clothing was evidence of a forgotten Western colony deep in the heart of Asia. It was a dramatic theory. It was also much easier to state than to prove. First, the textiles themselves. Wool was one of the most important materials found in and around the Tarim Basin burials. That alone tells us something significant. Sheep had to be raised, managed, sheared, and protected. Wool had to be cleaned, sorted, spun into yarn, and woven. None of that happens by accident. It requires animals, labour, tools, knowledge, and people willing to spend enormous amounts of time turning fleece into cloth. Think about the process. A sheep provides wool, but raw wool is not a shirt. It has to be transformed. Fibres must be twisted into thread with enough consistency that they do not snap. Threads must be arranged on a loom. The weaver has to control tension, count strands, create edges, and decide where colours will go. A simple woven textile is already a technical achievement. A patterned textile requires even more planning, and some of the Tarim fabrics were patterned. Checks, stripes, alternating colours. In a few cases, woven designs created through techniques related to twill, where threads pass over and under one another in a repeating offset pattern. This can create a diagonal texture, and when coloured yarns are arranged in bands, the result can look strikingly close to later plaid or tartan fabrics. That resemblance mattered because twill weaving had long been associated with Bronze Age textile traditions farther west, including parts of Europe and the Eurasian steppe. But resemblance is not a passport stamp. A weaving technique can move without an entire population moving. A skilled craft worker can teach another craft worker. A finished textile can be traded. A community can copy a pattern after seeing it once. And sometimes, people in different places develop similar solutions because they are working with the same material and facing the same problem. Wool behaves like wool whether you're in Scotland, Kazakhstan, or the Tarim Basin. If you want warmth, durability, and fabric that can be layered against cold wind, woven wool is a very good answer. If you want to make visual patterns from dyed yarn, crossing bands of colour is one of the most straightforward ways to do it. Similar technologies do not automatically mean direct descent. Similar designs do not automatically mean direct migration. But they do mean something. They tell us that the people of the Tarim Basin were not technologically isolated. They belong to a much wider ancient world in which animals, materials, skills, and ideas could move across enormous distances. The question was always how. Did people carry these textile traditions eastward themselves? Did local communities learn weaving methods through contact with neighbouring groups? Did wool, yarn, or cloth arrive through exchange networks? Were some techniques independently developed while others were borrowed? Before DNA, archaeologists could argue about these questions for decades. And they did. The clothing also reveals the environment these people lived in. The Tarim Basin is famous for heat now. Summer temperatures can be brutal, but deserts are not simply hot, they are extreme. Nights can turn cold quickly. Winters can be severe. Wind strips warmth from the body. Sand gets into everything. For communities living around the basin's shifting rivers, lakes, and desert margins, clothing was not decoration alone. It was survival technology. Felt was especially useful. Felt is not woven. It is made by matting animal fibres together using moisture, pressure, heat, and repeated working. The result can be thick, warm, and resistant to wind. Felt can be shaped into caps, shoes, liners, blankets, and coverings. It is ideal for people living with sheep and moving through exposed landscapes. Leather and fur offered similar protection. Leather could be cut and sewn into durable footwear, leggings, belts, and coverings. Fur trapped warmth. Hide could shield a body from cold, moisture, and abrasion. The people of Xiaohe had already shown how important cattle hides were in burial. Their clothing shows that animal skins were central in life as well. These were herding communities, or at least communities deeply dependent on herded animals. Sheep supplied wool, cattle supplied hides and food. Goats may also have contributed fibre, meat, and milk. The exact balance varied across sites and periods, and the archaeological record is incomplete. But the basic pattern is clear. These were not people surviving only by gathering plants in the desert. Their world depended on a sophisticated relationship with animals. That relationship shaped what they wore. A woven wool garment carried the labour of shepherds, spinners, dyers, and weavers. A leather boot carried the work of hunters or herders, hide processors, and skilled stitchers. A fur cap represented access to animal resources and knowledge of how to preserve them. Clothing was a portable record of an entire economy. And it was probably a statement of identity too. Even in modern societies, clothing tells people who belongs, who has status, who follows a tradition, who has access to wealth, and who is marking a special event. There is no reason to assume Bronze Age communities were different. A particular hat, a patterned wool cloth, a style of boot, a colour arrangement, or the use of feathers may have communicated things we can no longer read. Family, age, gender, role, ritual status, regional affiliation, or simply taste. That last possibility matters. Archaeologists are trained to search for meaning in every object, but sometimes people choose a pattern because they like it. Ancient people were practical, but they were not robots. A red and brown checked textile may have marked group identity, or it may have been beautiful. It may have done both at once. The mummies wore clothing made for harsh conditions, but they were not dressed only for function. Their garments show care, design, craft, decisions, and those decisions became evidence in a debate that would grow larger with every new discovery. For a long time, the logic seemed persuasive. European-looking textile parallels. Wool technology, felt hats, leatherwork, bodies with features that many observers interpreted as Western. Add it all together, and migration from the West looked like the simplest explanation. But archaeology has a warning built into it. The simplest looking explanation is not always the correct one. Objects travel. Techniques travel. Styles travel. Stories travel. A community can be genetically local to one region, while wearing clothes influenced by people hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Human cultures have always borrowed from neighbours. The Silk Road would later make that obvious on a massive scale. But exchange across Inner Asia did not begin when silk caravans appeared. It was already happening in much older, quieter forms. A strand of wool, a new loom technique, a herd animal, a pattern copied from a traveller's coat. The Tarim textiles were not trivial details wrapped around dead bodies. They were among the strongest clues researchers had. They showed that these people possessed impressive craft skills. They showed that herding mattered. They showed adaptation to a punishing climate. And they suggested connections, whether direct or indirect, to a wider world of steppe and Eurasian technologies. But textiles could only take the mystery so far. They could show contact. They could suggest influence. They could make migration plausible. What they could not do was reveal ancestry with certainty. For that, scientists would eventually need evidence no woven pattern could provide. Not a tartan-like check, not a felt hat, not a leather boot, not even a preserved face. They would need to recover the history written inside the people themselves. That history was written in bone. But before we get there was another kind of evidence waiting in the desert. Not in the dramatic faces, not in the patterned wool, in the smallest traces of everyday life. A grain of wheat, a fragment of animal bone, a chemical signature locked in tooth enamel, proteins trapped in ancient dental plaque, residue from milk transformed into something that could last longer than fresh milk ever could. Because surviving in the Tarim Basin was not just a matter of having the right clothes. You needed food, reliable food, food that could carry a family through a bad season, a failed harvest, a dying river channel, or a winter when pasture disappeared beneath frost and sand. And the people buried in these cemeteries had found ways to make a living at the edge of one of the harshest deserts on Earth. They were not simply wandering through empty dunes. They lived around the margins of the basin, near rivers, wetlands, seasonal lakes, and patches of land where water made life possible. These places were fragile. A river could shift, a lake could shrink, a green corridor could become dust within a few generations. But where water reached the soil, communities could do remarkable things. Archaeologists reconstruct their diet from several different kinds of evidence. Animal bones reveal which creatures were butchered, eaten, or kept nearby. Plant remains show what people gathered, cultivated, or received through exchange. Teeth preserve wear patterns and microscopic residues, and isotopes, subtle chemical variations in human bones and teeth, can reveal the kinds of foods people depended on over years of their lives. Each line of evidence has limits. A single grain does not prove a whole farming economy. A sheep bone does not tell us exactly how that sheep was used. Isotopes can show broad patterns, but not the contents of a particular meal. But when multiple clues point in the same direction, a picture begins to emerge. The people of the Tarim Basin drew on both animals and plants. Cattle were especially important. At Xiaohe, cattle had already appeared in the cemetery itself, in the form of hide-covered coffins, cattle skulls, and ritual objects. That tells us cattle had meaning beyond simple calories. They were woven into ceremony, burial, and identity. But cattle were also food. They provided meat, fat, hides, bone for tools, and perhaps most importantly, milk. Sheep and goats were equally valuable in different ways. Sheep provided wool, as the clothing makes clear, but they also offered meat, fat, milk, and skins. Goats were tough animals, capable of feeding in rougher terrain, where other livestock struggled. In a dry landscape with uncertain pasture that mattered. A herd was not just wealth, it was stored survival. You could move it when a river changed course. You could breed it, milk it, shear it, slaughter selected animals when necessary, trade animals, hides, wool, or dairy products with neighbouring groups. A community with herding knowledge had options that a purely settled farming village did not. But herding alone was not enough. Animals need water. Animals need grazing land. And deserts have a way of turning every plan into a gamble. That is why the food story of the Tarim Basin is so interesting. It does not look like a simple choice between farmers and nomads. It looks more like a flexible system built around oasis resources, livestock, and contact with wider networks. Wheat appears in the archaeological record of ancient Xinjiang, including areas around the Tarim Basin. So does millet. These crops came from very different agricultural worlds. Wheat had deep roots to the west, spreading eastward across Eurasia over thousands of years. Millet had long been cultivated farther east in northern China. Finding both in Inner Asia is a reminder that this region was never sealed off. Long before the Silk Road, crops were moving, skills were moving. People were experimenting with foods that had originated far beyond their own horizon. Wheat could be ground, cooked, and turned into filling meals. Millet was hardy, fast-growing, and useful in environments where conditions could be unpredictable. Neither crop magically made the desert fertile. Growing anything in the Tarim Basin depended on water, timing, labour, and local conditions. But small-scale cultivation near rivers and oases could complement herding. Imagine the strategy. Families keep sheep, goats, and cattle. They move animals to seasonal pasture when they can. They gather reeds, wild plants, fish, or waterfowl where wetlands allow it. They cultivate grains in patches of usable soil. They trade for resources they cannot produce themselves. If one food source fails, another might carry them through. That is resilience. And some of the most intimate evidence of this food system came from teeth. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up during life, can preserve microscopic traces of what people put in their mouths. It is not glamorous evidence. Nobody dreams of discovering ancient tartar. But for archaeologists, it can be extraordinary. In some Tarim Basin burials, researchers have identified milk proteins preserved in dental calculus. These proteins point to the consumption of dairy from animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats. That alone is significant. It shows that livestock were not only being raised for meat, wool, and hides. They were being milked. But there is an even more remarkable clue. At Xiaohe, ancient dairy remains have been found in burials, including small pieces of cheese-like material associated with the dead. Scientific analysis has indicated that some of these products were made from ruminant milk and processed through fermentation. In other words, these were not just carrying fresh milk from an animal to a cup. They were transforming it. Fermentation is survival technology. Fresh milk spoils quickly, especially without refrigeration. But when milk is fermented into yogurt-like products, cheese or kefir-style preparations, it can last longer. It can be easier to transport. It can provide concentrated nutrition. And fermentation can reduce lactose, making dairy easier to digest for people who may not have had the genetic ability to process large amounts of fresh milk as adults. That last point matters. Many ancient populations did not possess widespread lactase persistence, the genetic trait that allows adults to digest milk sugar efficiently throughout life. But people do not need that trait to use dairy. Fermentation changes the chemistry of milk. It makes a difficult food more manageable, so the people of Xiaohe may have had a cultural solution where biology offered no simple one. That is a pattern we will see again and again in human history. When environments become difficult, people do not merely wait for evolution to rescue them. They innovate, they preserve, they trade, they share techniques. They turn perishable food into something durable, and they pass that knowledge down. The Tarim Basin communities were living in a landscape that could punish any mistake. Too much dependence on crops could be dangerous when water failed. Too much dependence on herds could be dangerous when pasture collapsed. Too much isolation could be deadly when local resources ran out. Their answer seems to have been flexibility. Herd animals gave them mobility. Oasis landscapes offered water and limited cultivation. Wheat and millet added another layer of security. Dairy turned livestock into a renewable food source. Exchange networks brought in ideas and materials from outside the basin. They were not helpless desert dwellers. They were skilled managers of risk. And that makes the later argument over their appearance even more complicated. Because when outsiders first looked at these mummies, they saw faces that seemed to demand an explanation. High noses, deep-set eyes, light or reddish hair in some cases. Features that many people thought did not belong in ancient Western China. The food evidence had already suggested a community connected to a wider Eurasian world. Then the faces made that suggestion impossible to ignore. Those faces became famous long before most people knew where the Tarim Basin was. A photograph of a mummy can do something strange to the human brain. You look at skin dried hard as leather hair, still clinging to the scalp after thousands of years, a nose that seems sharply defined, cheekbones rising out of the shadows. And suddenly distance disappears. This is no longer an archaeological site. It feels like a person you might pass on a street. For many viewers, the first reaction was immediate. They look European. That phrase appeared again and again in newspaper headlines, museum captions, documentaries, books, and eventually across the internet. The mummies were described as blonde, red-haired, fair-featured, Caucasoid, Western-looking. Some writers went much further. They claimed the bodies proved that ancient Europeans had crossed all of Eurasia and settled in Western China thousands of years before the Silk Road. It was a dramatic idea, and dramatic ideas travel fast. The Tarim mummies seem to offer exactly the kind of evidence people love. Ancient bodies, remarkably preserved, with features that appeared to contradict the familiar map of history. China was supposed to be East Asia. Europe was supposed to be Europe. Between them stretched mountains, grasslands, deserts, and thousands of miles. So how could these people, buried in the Xinjiang desert as early as the Bronze Age, look so unfamiliar to modern expectations? The photographs intensified everything. Images of the so-called beauty of Lulan, with her delicate face and reddish-brown hair, circulated around the world. So did pictures of the Xinjiang man buried in a twill-wool garment, with a beard and hair that looked light brown or reddish under the desert conditions. Museum displays placed visitors face-to-face with the dead. Newspaper articles compressed complicated archaeological debates into a single irresistible question. Were Europeans in China first? But that question was already misleading. Because European is not a biological category that can be projected backward across 4,000 years. Modern Europeans are the result of many ancient population movements, mixtures, and evolutionary changes. The people living in Europe today are not a frozen template for every ancient person with a narrow nose, light hair, or a certain skull shape. And neither are modern Chinese populations a template for every person who lived in ancient Xinjiang. The Tarim Basin sits in a region shaped by movement. It lies between East Asia, the Eurasian steppe, Central Asia, Siberia, the Iranian plateau, and the high mountain corridors that connect them. For thousands of years, this was not the edge of the world. It was a crossroads with difficult terrain. People, animals, crops, textiles, technologies, and eventually languages moved through this wider region in many directions. So when archaeologists first encountered the Tarim mummies, they were not looking at a simple mystery with two possible answers, Chinese or European. They were looking at a population from Inner Asia, and Inner Asia has never fit neatly into modern categories. Still, the debate became polarized. One camp looked at the bodies, the wool textiles, the dairy economy, and certain apparent facial features, and argued that the Tarim people must have descended from migrants moving east from Western Eurasia, perhaps from the steppe, perhaps from Central Asia, perhaps from regions ultimately connected to the early Indo-European speaking world. Another camp urged caution. The mummies were ancient. Their soft tissues had changed through dehydration. Hair color can shift after death. Facial features can be distorted by burial conditions, preservation, and the simple fact that a dried face is not a living face. Even skeletons, while enormously valuable, do not provide a clean passport to a modern population. This is where the argument gets important. There are several kinds of evidence, and they do not all answer the same question. Skeletal morphology means the shape and measurements of bones, the skull, jaw, nose, teeth, limbs, and other anatomical details. It can help researchers compare ancient individuals with other populations. It can reveal broad patterns of similarity and difference. But morphology does not read out ancestry like a barcode. Human physical traits overlap. They vary within populations. They can be shaped by environment, diet, development, chance, and natural selection. A skull may resemble samples from one region without proving that its owner's ancestors came directly from that region. And the categories older physical anthropologists used, especially labels like Caucasoid and Mongoloid, were far too blunt for the real complexity of human history. Then there are facial reconstructions. These can be powerful. They put a face on someone who lived thousands of years ago. But they are interpretations built from bone, tissue depth averages, artistic decisions, and incomplete evidence. They can suggest possibilities. They cannot settle a migration debate. Textiles tell another story. The wool found in the Tarim Basin, including patterned twill fabrics that resemble traditions known farther west, clearly points to cultural connections across Eurasia. Techniques travel, materials travel, finished objects travel, skilled craftspeople can travel too, but a woven pattern is not DNA. A community can adopt clothing from trading partners. A family can inherit a textile tradition without sharing most of its ancestry with the people who first invented it. Today, people wear jeans made from a fabric with deep roots in other continents. Nobody would claim their genes came from the birthplace of denim. The same principle applies in the ancient world, only with longer distances and slower routes. And language creates even more confusion. Centuries after the earliest Tarim mummies were buried, written languages belonging to the Dzungarian branch of Indo-European appeared in oasis settlements around the northern Tarim Basin. That discovery electrified scholars. Here were Indo-European languages written in what is now Western China. To some, it seemed to confirm the obvious conclusion: the mummies must have been Dzungarians, ancient Western migrants preserved in the sand. But time matters. The earliest Tarim mummies predate the surviving Dzungarian texts by roughly 2,000 years or more. A language spoken in an oasis during the first millennium CE does not automatically identify the ancestry or language of people buried there in the early Bronze Age. Populations move, languages spread. One group can replace another, merge with another, or adopt another group's language. History is full of people speaking languages their distant ancestors never knew. So for decades, scholarship wrestled with competing models. Maybe the Tarim people came from the west, related to steppe herders who carried wool, cattle, and Indo-European languages eastward. Maybe they were linked to ancient populations from Central Asia, arriving through mountain corridors and oasis routes. Maybe the basin had received several migrations at different times, creating a mixed population whose clothing, language, and physical appearance reflected a long history of contact. Or maybe the earliest people of the Tarim Basin were something even more unexpected, deeply rooted in Inner Asia, culturally connected to distant neighbours, but genetically distinct from all the obvious candidates. For a long time, nobody could say for certain. The faces had started the argument. The clothes made it more convincing. The languages seemed to offer an answer. But every clue came with a warning. A face can mislead you. A textile can cross borders without its maker. A language can arrive centuries after the people you are trying to explain. To solve the mystery, archaeologists needed evidence that the desert had protected inside the bodies themselves. Not the shape of a skull, not the colour of hair, not a pattern woven into wool. They needed the molecules carried by every cell, the record of ancestry written in ancient DNA. Before ancient DNA could answer that question, researchers had to work with the clues they could see: bones, textiles, burials, animals, crops, the locations of old settlements, and maps, lots of maps. Scholars looked at the Tarim Basin and saw a place surrounded by possible routes. To the north lay the open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. To the west, mountain corridors led towards Central Asia. To the east and northeast were regions connected to Gansu, Mongolia, and northern China. The basin looked isolated on a modern map, but to ancient travellers it may have been connected by a chain of seasonal routes, river valleys, mountain passes, and oasis stops. The first major theory was the Western migration model. According to this idea, pastoralists from the steppe had moved eastward into the Tarim Basin during the Bronze Age. These were people whose lives revolved around herds, sheep, cattle, goats, perhaps horses, depending on the time and place. They knew wool, they knew dairying, they knew how to survive in harsh grassland environments where mobility was often the difference between life and death. And when archaeologists looked at the Tarim mummies, they found things that seemed to fit. Woolen textiles, cattle and sheep remains, evidence of dairy foods, certain styles of weaving, burials that some researchers felt resembled traditions found far to the west. The idea was simple and powerful. Steppe herders had crossed eastward, entered the desert basin, and brought parts of their world with them. For decades, one archaeological culture became central to this argument: the Afanasyevo culture. The Afanasyevo people lived on the southern Siberian and Altai steppe, around 3,300 to 2,500 BCE. Their material culture showed striking similarities to the earlier Yamnaya herders farther west on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. They raised livestock, used wheeled vehicles, and buried their dead in ways that seemed connected to a much wider steppe tradition. Most importantly, Afanasyevo groups had already moved remarkably far east. They were living near the Altai Mountains, not impossibly far from the routes leading toward Xinjiang. So some scholars proposed a dramatic chain of events. Steppe herders moved east from Western Eurasia. Afanasyevo populations carried that expansion into the Altai region. Their descendants or related groups then continued south into the Tarim Basin. It was an elegant theory because it linked several mysteries at once. It could explain the wool. It could explain the herding. It could explain why some of the mummies seemed, at least to early observers, physically unlike many later East Asian populations. And for scholars interested in ancient languages, it offered an even bigger possibility. If Afanasyevo groups spoke an early Indo-European language, perhaps they were connected to the ancestors of the later Tocharian-speaking communities of the Tarim Basin. Suddenly, a desert cemetery was being placed inside one of the largest stories in Eurasian history: the expansion of Indo-European languages across enormous distances. But there was a problem, actually. There were several. The Afanasyevo culture was not sitting inside the Tarim Basin. It was centered much farther north in a different ecological world. And similarities in burial customs or livestock economies do not automatically prove that one population became another. People can move, ideas can move, animals can move. A herding strategy can spread from community to community without a mass migration replacing everyone already living there. Then there was the question of timing. Some of the earliest Tarim mummies date to around 2000 BCE, long after the classic Afanasyevo period had begun to disappear from the archaeological record. That does not make a connection impossible. Descendants can survive after a named archaeological culture ends. Cultural traditions can continue in changed forms. But it means the story could not simply be Afanasyevo arrives, Tarim mummies appear, mystery solved. History is rarely that tidy. Another steppe culture entered the debate, Andronovo. The Andronovo horizon emerged later, roughly from around 2000 BCE onward, spreading across huge parts of Kazakhstan, southern Siberia, and Central Asia. These were also mobile pastoral communities, skilled in managing livestock across open landscapes. They are often associated with bronze working, settlements, cemeteries, and a world of grassland exchange stretching thousands of miles, because Andronovo groups were later than Afanasievo, and because they occupied regions closer to Central Asia. Some researchers suggested that they might have brought Western Eurasian ancestry, technologies or languages toward Xinjiang. Again, there were clues that seemed encouraging. The Tarim Basin had wool. It had herding. It had contact with the steppe world. Later populations in Xinjiang clearly did interact with peoples from Central Asia and the northern grasslands. But Andronovo created another chronological problem. The earliest Tarim communities were already there, before the Andronovo horizon could easily explain their origins. So Andronovo might help explain later contacts, later migrations, or later cultural changes. It was much harder to use it as the single origin point for the oldest desert burials. That distinction matters. The question was not just, who ever entered Xinjiang? Many populations entered Xinjiang over thousands of years. The real question was narrower and much more difficult. Who were the earliest people buried at places like Xiaohe and Gumugo? Where did their ancestors come from? And how much of their culture came from their own inherited traditions versus contact with distant neighbours? Other scholars looked in a different direction. Instead of imagining the Tarim Basin as the final destination of westward herders, they proposed that its early inhabitants may have had stronger roots in eastern Eurasia. Perhaps populations moved inland from the north and east, from regions linked to Siberia, Mongolia, northern China, or the ancient river systems beyond the desert. This model made sense geographically too. The Tarim Basin was not only open to the west, its northern edge touched roots below the Tian Shan Mountains. Its eastern corridors connected toward the Gansu region. Its river-fed oases could have drawn in small groups from several directions over many generations. Maybe the people who settled there were not foreign arrivals from one dramatic migration. Maybe they were descendants of ancient northern inner Asian populations who had lived around the wider region for a very long time. And then there was the middle position. Maybe everyone was partly right. Perhaps the Tarim Basin had been settled by one population, then contacted by another. Perhaps early communities received livestock from steppe herders, crops from eastern farming societies, metalworking ideas from Central Asia, and textile techniques from travelling specialists. Perhaps marriages between groups slowly created mixed communities. Not one invasion, not one origin, a long series of encounters. This was, in many ways, the most realistic model. Ancient frontiers are rarely clean lines. They are contact zones. A trader arrives with wool. A herder brings sheep. A family marries into another community. A child grows up speaking one language while wearing clothes made in another tradition. Over centuries, the result can look like a puzzle assembled from pieces that began very far apart. But archaeology has a limit. It can show that people were connected. A textile style can reveal shared knowledge. Animal bones can reveal a new economy. A bronze object can point to trade routes. A burial custom can suggest that ideas, or perhaps people, crossed a border. What archaeology cannot always tell us is exactly what moved. Did a new kind of wool arrive because migrants brought it? Because local people traded for it? Because a craft specialist married into the community? Because someone copied a design seen hundreds of miles away? The objects do not answer on their own, and that was the trap behind the old migration theories. Each one could point to real connections. Steppe connections were real. Eastern connections were real. Central Asian contacts were real. Later population movements were real. But connection is not the same thing as ancestry. A people can be culturally linked to a distant world without being descended mainly from that world. And a population can carry ancestry from one region while speaking a language, wearing clothing, and practicing rituals learned from another. For years, the Tarim mummies remained suspended between these possibilities. Then the researchers finally reached the evidence that could test them. Not perfectly, not without new questions, but more directly than skull shapes, cloth patterns, or old maps ever could. They reached the DNA. But before the DNA results arrived, there was one more clue that made the mystery even more complicated. Language, not the language of the earliest mummies. Nobody left us a written diary from Xiaohe. No wooden marker tells us what the dead called themselves. No inscription survives from those ancient desert communities, explaining where they came from or what words they used around their fires. But much later, along the northern edge of the Tarim Basin, something extraordinary appeared. Texts. Thousands of fragments written on paper, wood, and other materials preserved in the dry air of oasis towns. Religious manuscripts, business records, monastic documents. Letters, translations, pieces of a lost world emerging from caves, ruined settlements, and abandoned temples. These texts were written in languages now called Tocharian, and when scholars began deciphering them in the early 20th century, they realized they had found something astonishing. Tocharian was Indo-European. That may not sound shocking at first. Indo-European languages are everywhere today. English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, Greek, Irish, Bengali. They belong to a language family spoken across much of Europe and large parts of Asia. But Xinjiang, deep inside what is now Western China, on the far eastern edge of Central Asia, researchers had discovered ancient languages related, however distantly, to languages spoken thousands of miles away. It was like finding an old branch of the same family tree growing in the middle of the desert. The surviving texts mainly date from roughly the 6th through 8th centuries CE. They come from oasis regions along the northern Tarim Basin, especially around places such as Kucha, Karashar, and Turfan. The languages are usually divided into two major forms, Tocharian A and Tocharian B. Tocharian A seems to have been used primarily in religious contexts, especially Buddhist texts. Tocharian B appears more widely in everyday documents, and may have been spoken in the kingdom of Kucha. These were not vague traces. They were real languages with grammar, vocabulary, inflections, and written traditions. And they were strange in a fascinating way. Tocharian belonged to the Indo-European family, but it was not simply an Eastern version of Sanskrit or Persian. In some features it looked unexpectedly closer to the so-called centum branch of Indo-European, a category that includes languages such as Latin, Greek, and Celtic. That was a major surprise because many Indo-European languages farther east, including Indo-Iranian languages, belong to a different broad grouping. Researchers suddenly had a puzzle. How did an Indo-European language end up so far east? One answer seemed almost irresistible. Maybe the ancient Tarim mummies were the Tocharians. Maybe those striking Bronze Age burials, the wool textiles, the livestock economy, and the later Indo-European texts were all parts of one continuous story. Steppe migrants moved east. They entered the Tarim Basin. Their descendants became the Tocharian-speaking people of the oasis kingdoms. Simple, elegant, and not proven. The problem is time. The earliest mummies from the Tarim Basin date to around 2000 BCE, and in some cases a little earlier. The surviving Tocharian manuscripts appear more than 2000 years later. In human terms, that is an almost unimaginable gap. Think about it. 2000 years before the first surviving Tocharian texts were written, the Roman Empire had not yet existed. Buddhism had not yet spread into the Tarim oases. The Silk Road, as most people imagine it, had not yet formed. Entire civilizations would rise, expand, fragment, and disappear in the interval between the oldest desert burials and the documents found in later oasis towns. So could the earliest mummies have spoken an ancestral form of Tocharian? Possibly, but possibility is not evidence. Languages can survive for a very long time. A language spoken by a small population can persist through enormous political changes, especially in isolated valleys, mountain regions, or oasis networks. But languages can also disappear quickly. A new ruling elite arrives. Trade changes, a religion spreads, communities become bilingual. Parents begin teaching children a new language because it brings opportunity, status, or safety. Within a few centuries, sometimes even less, the language map can be transformed. And that brings us to one of the most important rules in ancient history. Genes, languages, and culture do not always travel together. A population can adopt a new language without being replaced by new people. A migrating group can leave behind its genes but lose its original language. A community can wear foreign-style clothing, raise imported animals, practice a borrowed religion, and still speak the language of its ancestors. Or the opposite can happen. People can retain much of their ancestry while shifting completely into the language of newcomers. We see versions of this throughout history. In many parts of the world, populations changed languages because of trade, empire, religion, migration, or political power. The spread of Latin did not mean every speaker of later Romance languages was descended mainly from people living in ancient Rome. The spread of Arabic did not erase the deep ancestry of every population that eventually spoke Arabic. English spread across continents, but English speakers today do not all share one biological origin. Language is learned, genes are inherited, material culture is shared, copied, traded, adapted, and reinvented. Sometimes all three move together. Sometimes they do not. That is why the Tocharian discovery was so important, but also so dangerous. It gave researchers a powerful clue to the later history of Xinjiang. It showed that Indo-European languages were once spoken in the Tarim Oasis world. It strengthened the case that this region had long been connected to wider Eurasian networks. But it did not automatically identify the people buried at Xiaohe. The earliest mummies did not leave Tocharian manuscripts. They lived more than 2 millennia before the texts we can actually read. Between them stood countless generations, possible migrations, marriages, cultural shifts, and lost languages. Maybe some distant connection existed. Maybe later Tocharian-speaking groups inherited part of their ancestry from older Tarim populations. Maybe they arrived later from elsewhere, mixed with communities already living in the basin, and adopted parts of local life. Maybe the truth involves several different populations, entering the region at different times, each leaving something behind. That was the real lesson. The Tarim Basin was not a sealed tomb containing one frozen people and one simple identity. It was a crossroads disguised as a desert. Languages arrived. Technologies arrived. Religions arrived. Herding traditions, crops, textiles and ideas moved through its oases over thousands of years. And the oldest mummies stood at the beginning of that story, not necessarily at its end. To find out who they really were, researchers would need evidence from the bodies themselves. Not faces, not clothing, not language spoken 2,000 years later. DNA. DNA sounds like a final answer, a code hidden inside every cell, waiting to tell us exactly who someone was and where they came from. But ancient DNA is not that simple. It is not a clean message preserved for thousands of years, like a letter sealed in a bottle. It is more like trying to reconstruct an enormous book after it has been left outside in the rain for 4,000 years. Most pages are gone. The surviving pages are torn into tiny pieces. Some words have been changed, and before you can read anything, you have to make absolutely sure that nobody has accidentally mixed in pages from a modern book. That is the challenge facing researchers who study ancient human remains. DNA begins breaking down almost immediately after death. Heat, moisture, microbes, and time all destroy it. Long strands of genetic material snap into shorter and shorter fragments. Chemical changes alter individual DNA letters. Modern human DNA from archaeologists, museum workers, excavators, and laboratory staff can easily overwhelm the faint ancient signal if strict precautions are not followed. And the Tarim Basin mummies presented a strange combination of advantages and problems. The dry desert environment preserved their faces, clothing, hair, and even food remains with extraordinary detail. But visible preservation is not the same thing as genetic preservation. A body can look remarkably intact, while its DNA has been damaged almost beyond use. And many of these mummies had been excavated, handled, studied, and stored long before ancient DNA technology became advanced enough to answer the biggest questions. So scientists had to work carefully. First, they chose the best possible samples. Two parts of the human body are especially valuable in ancient DNA research: teeth and a dense part of the skull called the petrous bone. The petrous bone sits near the inner ear. It is one of the hardest bones in the body, almost like a tiny natural vault. Because it is so dense, it can sometimes protect genetic material better than more porous bone. Teeth can be useful for a similar reason. The hard outer layers shield the inner pulp chamber, where blood vessels and cells once existed. If any usable DNA has survived, these protected spaces may hold it. Researchers do not simply swab the surface and hope for the best. The outside of an ancient bone or tooth may be covered in modern contamination, accumulated during burial, excavation, transport, or museum storage. Instead, samples are cleaned, often with ultraviolet light and chemical treatment, then taken into specialized clean laboratories designed to keep modern DNA out. The people working there wear full protective clothing: masks, gloves, hair coverings, bodysuits. Equipment is sterilized. Airflow is controlled. Separate facilities are used for ancient DNA and modern DNA, because even a few shed skin cells from a researcher can create confusion. Then comes the destructive part. A small amount of bone or tooth is drilled into powder. Chemicals are used to release whatever DNA fragments remain. These fragments may be incredibly short, sometimes only a few dozen genetic letters long. Modern genomes contain billions of letters. Ancient DNA researchers are often working with scraps. But scraps can still be enough. Using sequencing machines, scientists read millions, sometimes billions, of these tiny fragments. Computers then compare them to the human reference genome, looking for pieces that match known locations in human DNA. It is a little like finding shredded fragments of a map and working out where each piece belongs. And there is one clue that helps distinguish truly ancient DNA from modern contamination. Ancient DNA has damage patterns. Over time, certain chemical changes tend to occur near the ends of broken DNA fragments. One of the most common is a change that makes a letter called cytosine appear as thymine during sequencing. Researchers expect to see this kind of damage in genuinely ancient molecules. They also expect ancient fragments to be short. Modern contamination usually looks different. It tends to be longer, less damaged, and suspiciously similar to the DNA of people who may have handled the sample. Scientists can also estimate contamination by examining mitochondrial DNA, the small set of genetic material passed mainly through mothers, or by looking at sex chromosomes in male individuals. If a male skeleton appears to contain too many different versions of the X chromosome, that may signal DNA from modern women has entered the sample. None of these checks is perfect by itself, but together they build a case. Is the DNA fragmented in the way ancient DNA should be? Does it show the expected chemical damage? Do independent samples tell a consistent story? Do the genetic results fit the age and archaeological context of the remains? Can another laboratory reproduce the result? This is how ancient DNA becomes evidence, rather than just an exciting headline. And if you enjoy mysteries where a single new piece of evidence forces experts to rethink an entire story, the channel's book about 12 unexplained mysteries goes even deeper into cases like this. You can find it on the website with the link in the description. Once researchers have authenticated the DNA, the next question is even harder. What does it mean? A genome does not come with a label saying, "I am from this people," or "my language was this," or "my ancestors migrated here in a particular year." DNA can reveal biological relationships between populations. It can show whether individuals shared recent ancestry. It can identify patterns of mixture, isolation, and descent. But it cannot directly tell us what people called themselves. To make sense of a newly sequenced ancient genome, scientists compare it with many others: ancient hunter-gatherers from Siberia, Bronze Age herders from the steppe, early farmers from different parts of Eurasia, ancient populations from Central Asia, East Asia, and farther west. They also compare it with present-day populations, while remembering that modern people are not frozen relics of the past. Every living population has its own long history of migration and mixture. The computer models search for patterns. Which populations share the most genetic variants? Which ancient groups form branches close together on a family tree? Can one population be modelled as a mixture of two or more earlier populations? Does it carry ancestry that is common in one region but rare in another? One way to picture this is as a vast genetic landscape. Individuals with more shared ancestry tend to appear closer together. Individuals with less shared ancestry appear farther apart. This is called genetic clustering. But here is where headlines often go wrong. A cluster is not a tribe. It is not a nation. It is not a language family. It is not proof that everyone in the cluster saw themselves as one people, lived in one place, or shared one culture. It is simply a statistical pattern. These genomes are more similar to one another in certain measurable ways than they are to the genomes being compared, and the answer depends on the comparison set. If researchers say an ancient group has no close match among known populations, they do not mean the people were aliens. They do not mean they appeared from nowhere. They do not even necessarily mean they had no relatives. They mean that, among the ancient and modern genomes currently sampled, no population provides a simple, close genetic match. That distinction matters enormously. The ancient world is still mostly unsampled. Vast regions have yielded little or no recoverable DNA. Many populations disappeared without leaving descendants that can be clearly identified today. Others may be represented by only a handful of skeletons, from one cemetery, one valley, one brief moment in time. Imagine trying to reconstruct every branch of a forest after finding only a few leaves. That is what ancient population genetics often looks like. So when the Tarim mummies were finally sequenced, the real surprise was not that their DNA belonged to no known population on Earth. The surprise was more precise and more fascinating. They did not fit the simple migration story many people expected. They were not straightforward descendants of the Bronze Age steppe herders who seemed, from clothing and lifestyle alone, like such obvious candidates. Their ancestry reached back into a far older layer of Eurasian history, a layer that had survived in the desert, almost like the mummies themselves. And in 2021, a major genome study gave that hidden ancestry a name. That name came from one of the most unexpected results in ancient DNA research. In 2021, an international team published a major study of ancient genomes from Xinjiang. Not one mummy, not one famous face from a museum display. They analysed DNA from 18 Bronze Age individuals, dating roughly from 3000 to 1700 BCE, from two very different parts of what is now far western China. One group came from Dzungaria, the open region north of the Tian Shan Mountains. The other came from the Tarim Basin, the vast desert world where the famous mummies had been found. This comparison was crucial, because Dzungaria and the Tarim Basin are close enough to appear connected on a modern map. But ancient landscapes are not modern maps. Between them stood mountain ranges, difficult passes, shifting climates, and separate networks of movement. A population living north of the Tian Shan could have had a very different history from a population living in the desert south of them. And that is exactly what the genomes showed. The Dzungarian individuals had ancestry consistent with mixture. Their DNA carried signals linked to populations from the Eurasian steppe, including groups related to the Afanasievo culture, Bronze Age herders who had spread eastward across the grasslands. This was not completely shocking. Dzungaria opened onto the steppe. It was a place where herders, animals, technologies and families could move across enormous distances. But the Tarim individuals were different. When researchers plotted their genomes against ancient populations from across Eurasia, the Tarim people formed their own tight cluster. They were genetically similar to one another, but did not fit neatly among the Bronze Age steppe herders, early Iranian farmers, East Asian agricultural populations, or the mixed Central Asian groups that had been proposed as their likely ancestors. They looked local, not local in the sense that DNA can point to a specific village and say, they were born here, it cannot do that, but local in the deeper population genetic sense. The sampled Tarim individuals appeared to descend largely from a population that had been living in this broader region for a very long time, without the large recent influx of Western steppe ancestry many researchers had expected. That was the bombshell. For decades, the mummies had seemed to tell a Western story. Their physical appearance had been described as more West Eurasian than East Asian. Their wool textiles resembled traditions known farther west. Their cattle, sheep, wheat, dairy practices, and certain burial customs all seemed to point toward connections with steppe pastoralists or farming populations moving east across Central Asia. And those connections were real, but connection is not the same thing as replacement. A people can adopt animals from one neighbour, crops from another, textile techniques from a third, and still remain genetically distinct. Human history is full of this. Culture travels in ways genes do not. A new food can cross a continent in a few generations. A marriage network can move genes across a mountain range. But neither process has to happen at the same speed or in the same direction. The Tarim data forced researchers to separate those stories. These mummies were not simply a lost colony of recent migrants from the western steppe. They were not straightforward Afanasievo herders who had crossed into the desert and preserved their old identity in the sand. And they were not best explained as a recent blend of Western and Eastern populations. Instead, the study found that their ancestry was dominated by something much older, a genetic lineage connected to ancient North Eurasians. This was a population known from a small number of extremely ancient individuals in Siberia, people who lived many thousands of years before the Bronze Age, before the Silk Road, before cities rose across much of Eurasia. Their genetic signature had survived in diluted form in several later populations. But in the sampled Tarim individuals, it appeared at an extraordinary level. It was like finding an old melody preserved inside a song recorded thousands of years later. The people of the Tarim Basin were not genetically identical to those ancient Siberians, of course. No population remains frozen through time. They had their own history, their own generations of adaptation, marriage, loss, and survival. But the genetic models suggested that they retained ancestry from this deep Ancient North Eurasian layer, with comparatively little evidence of the recent steppe mixture that had seemed so obvious from the archaeological clues. That is why the finding was so surprising. The desert had preserved bodies that looked, to many observers, like evidence of migration from the west. Then DNA revealed a population whose deepest detectable ancestry did not match that simple explanation. Picture two neighbouring worlds around 4,000 years ago. North of the mountains in Dzungaria, herding communities mixed with populations connected to the steppe. Their genomes recorded movement, contact and admixture across the grasslands. South of the mountains in the Tarim Basin, the sampled communities formed a distinct genetic cluster. They were not cut off from the world culturally. They used dairy products. They raised livestock. They cultivated crops whose origins lay beyond the desert. But their genes suggested a population history far older and more locally rooted than anyone had expected. It was a perfect warning against judging ancestry by appearances. A wool cloak does not equal a genome. A horse, a cow, or a stalk of wheat does not equal a migration. Even a face can mislead us. Human features are shaped by many genes, by chance, by environment, and by the expectations of people looking at them thousands of years later. But there is an important limit here. The 2021 study was powerful. It was not omniscient. 18 individuals cannot represent every person who ever lived across Xinjiang. The Tarim Basin is enormous. Its oases were scattered across hundreds of miles. Communities lived there across millennia. Some samples came from particular cemeteries, including the famous Xiaohe site, and most belonged to a specific window of the early Bronze Age. They do not automatically tell us the genetic history of every later oasis population, every earlier hunter-gatherer, or every group that passed through the region. And even within a single cemetery, the people buried there may have been one community, one lineage, or one socially selected part of a larger population. Ancient DNA is always a view through a narrow window. But this window changed the entire room. The Tarim mummies were no longer best understood as mysterious Western strangers in China. They appeared to be descendants of an ancient Eurasian population that had endured near the edges of the steppe and desert, then built a life in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. And to understand just how deep that ancestry went, we have to go back far beyond the Bronze Age, back to the ancient people geneticists call the Ancient North Eurasians. Ancient North Eurasians. The name sounds like it belongs to some vanished empire, some people whose cities are buried beneath the Siberian ice. But it is actually a genetic label, a way of describing a very old branch of human ancestry reconstructed from prehistoric DNA. Not a tribe with a flag, not a language group we can name, not a single nation stretching across the north, a deep lineage. To understand it, go north and west from the Tarim Basin, far beyond the deserts of Xinjiang, beyond the Altai Mountains, into Siberia, where winters can turn the landscape into something almost unrecognizable from the world of the mummies. There, near the village of Malta beside the Balea River, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient child. The individual is often called MA1, short for Malta 1. He lived around 24,000 years ago during the last ice age. That means he lived long before the Tarim mummies, before the Bronze Age, before horses pulled chariots across the steppe, before the first cities of Mesopotamia had risen to their height, before the Silk Road was even imaginable. And yet his genome became one of the keys to explaining the mystery of the Tarim Basin. When geneticists analysed the Malta individual and other ancient people from the broader Siberian region, they found ancestry that did not fit neatly into the categories people had once used for Eurasia. It was not simply ancestral to later Europeans. It was not simply ancestral to East Asians. It was part of a much older population history, one that had contributed genetic ancestry to people across enormous distances. Researchers called this ancestry Ancient North Eurasian, often shortened to ANE. Think of it like an old river system. Today you can look at a landscape and see separate rivers flowing east, west, north and south. But trace them back far enough and some began in the same high mountain watershed. Ancient North Eurasian ancestry is that kind of watershed, a deep source population or more likely a network of related Ice Age populations whose genetic legacy later flowed into many different groups. Parts of this ancestry appear in ancient Siberians. It contributed to later populations in the Eurasian steppe. It is also one of the deep ancestral components found in indigenous peoples of the Americas, through the complicated population history of Northeast Asia and Beringia. That alone tells us something important. The people associated with ancient North Eurasian ancestry were not isolated in one tiny corner of Siberia forever. Their descendants, or populations related to them, became part of a much larger human story. Their genetic traces spread, mixed, weakened, reappeared, and were reshaped by thousands of years of migration and intermarriage. But by the Bronze Age, pure ancestry is almost never what we are dealing with. Human populations mix, they split, they absorb newcomers. They lose lineages through chance, warfare, disease, climate shifts, and simple demographic bad luck. A genetic signal that was once widespread can become diluted almost everywhere. Then, thousands of years later, it survives most clearly in a place no one expected. A place like the Tarim Basin. This is what made the 2021 results so extraordinary. The Tarim individuals were related to this ancient North Eurasian deep ancestry. But that does not mean they were identical to the people of Malta. They were separated from the Malta individual by roughly 20,000 years. That is an almost unimaginable span of time. More than enough time for populations to move, change, shrink, grow and develop entirely new identities. The Tarim people were not Ice Age Siberians who somehow walked into the desert unchanged. They were Bronze Age people with their own lives, their own burial traditions, their own food systems, their own families and their own local history. Their DNA suggested that they carried an unusually high proportion of ancestry related to that ancient northern Eurasian lineage, alongside ancestry connected to ancient populations farther east in Siberia. In other words, they were not a perfect genetic fossil. They were a branch that had remained comparatively separate, while many neighbouring populations underwent major waves of mixture. Picture what was happening across Eurasia around the same broad period. Grassland herders were moving across the steppe. Farming communities were expanding and exchanging crops. Mountain corridors were carrying animals, metals, technologies, and people in both directions. In many regions, one population met another, married into another, or was gradually absorbed by another. Genomes became mosaics, layered with ancestry from multiple sources. But the Tarim Basin was different. It was not easy country. The Taklamakan Desert was not an open plain where anyone could simply wander in, settle down, and survive. Life depended on water. Oases were separated by dangerous distances. Mountains stood to the north and west. The desert itself formed a vast barrier around the communities living along its edges. Isolation did not mean total silence. We already know these people had cultural links beyond the basin. They had livestock. They used dairy products. They possessed crops and technologies, with wider Eurasian histories. But genetic isolation can work differently from cultural connection. A community may trade with strangers without marrying them in large numbers. It may adopt a new crop without being replaced by the people who first cultivated it. It may wear imported wool, drink milk from introduced animals, and preserve a genetic history that reaches back thousands of years before any of those things arrived. That appears to be part of what happened in the Tarim Basin. Their ancestors may have occupied the broader region when it was very different environmentally, perhaps before the desert reached its later form, perhaps through a chain of populations living around the northern margins of Inner Asia. Over time, as climates shifted and landscapes became more fragmented, some communities could have become increasingly separated from the large population movements transforming the steppe and surrounding regions. And in that separation, an older ancestry survived. Not untouched. No human group is untouched by time, but preserved at a level that was unusual compared with the mixed populations known from much of Bronze Age Eurasia. This is the real meaning behind the headline claim that their DNA matched no known population on Earth. It does not mean the Tarim mummies were outside humanity. It does not mean they belonged to some lost species, some secret civilization, or a population that appeared from nowhere. Their DNA was completely human DNA. Their ancestry could be compared with other ancient and living populations. Geneticists could identify relationships, estimate mixtures, and model likely population histories. What the study showed was more subtle, and in some ways more fascinating. The Tarim people did not closely match any single living population because living populations have continued changing for 4,000 years. They have mixed with neighbours, moved across continents, endured bottlenecks, and inherited ancestry from countless later events. The Tarim mummies were not unknown because they had no relatives. They were surprising because their closest genetic relatives were deep in the past. Their story had been preserved, not in a modern nation, not in a surviving ethnic label, but in the genomes of ancient Ice Age people from Siberia, and in a desert cemetery where the sand protected faces, clothes, boats, and fragments of a population history no one had expected to find. But this is where language matters. Because matched no known population on Earth is the kind of phrase that can make a scientific result sound more mysterious than it really is. It suggests a people with no ancestors, no cousins, no place in the human family tree. That is not what the DNA showed. The Tarim mummies did not come from nowhere. They were not genetically separate from every other human being who has ever lived. Their genomes contained ancestry that researchers could recognize, compare, and model. The surprise was that they did not closely resemble the populations archaeologists expected to find in Bronze Age Xinjiang. That is a very different claim. Think about the difference between saying, "This person has no family," and saying, "We searched the records we have and we could not find a close match." One is a statement about reality. The other is a statement about the limits of the records. Ancient DNA works the same way. When scientists compare a 4,000-year-old genome with known populations, they are not comparing it with every human community that ever existed. That would be impossible. Most ancient people left no DNA behind. Most remains were never preserved. Most preserved remains have never been excavated. And of those that have been found, only a tiny fraction have been genetically sequenced. The ancient DNA record is not a complete map of the past. It is more like a map with a few bright dots of light scattered across a vast dark landscape. There are regions with lots of samples. Europe, for example, has produced enormous numbers of ancient genomes from hunter-gatherers, early farmers, steppe herders, Bronze Age communities, Roman-era populations, medieval burials, and more. Siberia has also become increasingly important, especially because its cold conditions can preserve DNA remarkably well. But other regions remain much harder to see. Hot climates destroy DNA quickly. Humid soil can erase it. Political borders, funding limitations, restrictions on sampling, and the simple difficulty of reaching remote archaeological sites all shape what gets studied. A population can have existed for thousands of years and leave behind no usable DNA at all. So when researchers say the early Tarim people did not match any known population, known is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Known to whom? Known from which cemetery? Known from which time period? Known through which surviving samples? A community that lived in the mountains north of the Tarim Basin 5,000 years ago may have been genetically close to the mummies. But if no one has found that community, or if its bones no longer contain recoverable DNA, then it cannot appear in the analysis. It remains invisible, even if it was once part of the same larger population network. And there is another complication. Populations are not fixed objects. They are not coloured blocks on a map, each one neatly separated from the next. They move, they split into smaller groups, they mix with neighbours, they lose members, they gain newcomers. A lineage can be common in one era, then become diluted over centuries until it is barely detectable. Another can survive only in a remote valley, an island, or an oasis at the edge of a desert. By the time we reach the present day, almost every population on Earth has been reshaped by thousands of years of migration and mixture. That means a Bronze Age community may have no close modern equivalent, even when its ancestry was once widespread. Imagine taking a drop of ink and placing it in a river. At first, the drop remains dark and concentrated, but as the current moves, it spreads through tributaries, mixes with other water, and becomes harder and harder to isolate. 4,000 years of human history can do that to genes. The Tarim mummies were not an ink drop that appeared from nowhere. They were a dark patch preserved near the edge of the current. This is why geneticists use statistical models rather than simple yes or no labels. They take genomes from ancient individuals and compare patterns across hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. Then they test different possible histories. Could this population be explained as a mixture of ancient steppe herders and East Asian farmers? Could it be mostly descended from one previously sampled Siberian population? Could it represent a branch that separated from other northern Eurasian groups long before the Bronze Age? The models are powerful, but they are only as good as the reference populations available. A reference panel is basically the set of comparison genomes scientists have in hand. If the relevant ancestral population is missing from that panel, the model cannot point directly to it. At best, it can identify the nearest available relatives. It is like trying to identify an old language using only a few surviving dictionaries. You may be able to say, this language seems related to this family, but you cannot confidently name its exact source if the most important dictionary has been lost. That is why interpretations change, not because genetic research is unreliable, but because it is alive. Every newly sequenced genome adds another clue. A burial in Mongolia, a cave in Siberia, an oasis settlement in Central Asia, a cemetery in the High Pamirs. Any of these could reveal a population that changes the picture. A group that once seemed isolated may turn out to have had close relatives in a region nobody had sampled yet. Science does not hide this uncertainty. At its best, it puts uncertainty right in the conclusion. The 2021 Tarim study did not prove that the mummies belonged to a population with no connection to the rest of Earth. It showed that the sampled early Tarim individuals formed an unusually distinctive genetic group. They appeared to be descendants of an ancient lineage related to Ancient North Eurasians, with a contribution from ancient populations farther east in Siberia. And compared with nearby Bronze Age groups, they showed surprisingly little evidence of the large-scale mixture many researchers had expected. That is the stronger conclusion. Not alien, not impossible, not unrelated to everyone, unusually isolated descendants of a very old human lineage. And honestly, that is more interesting than the sensational version. because a population with no ancestry would be a dead end, a gimmick, a mystery with no human meaning. But a population carrying a deep ancestral signal into the Bronze Age, while surrounding societies were being transformed by migration, herding, trade and intermarriage. That tells us something real about the human past. It tells us that isolation can preserve history. It tells us that deserts do not simply separate people from the world. Sometimes they preserve older worlds inside them, and it forces us to ask the next question. If the Tarim people were genetically distinctive, how did they come to share so much with the wider world? How did a community with deep local ancestry end up using cattle, sheep, goats, wheat, millet, dairy, and technologies connected to lands far beyond the desert? The answer is one of the most important lessons of the Tarim Basin. Genes and culture do not always travel together. That sounds backwards at first. If the early Tarim people were genetically isolated, shouldn't their way of life have been isolated too? Shouldn't they have been living with only local plants, local animals, local tools, local traditions? A sealed-off population at the bottom of a desert, cut off from the great currents moving across Bronze Age Eurasia. But the archaeology says something more complicated. The people of the Tarim Basin were not culturally frozen. They were using wheat, a crop whose early history lies far to the west, in Southwest Asia. They were also using millet, a grain with deep roots in northern China and East Asia. They kept sheep, goats, and cattle. They processed dairy products. They made textiles from wool, and in some communities their material culture shows knowledge of technologies and practices shared across huge distances. So here is the paradox. Their genes suggest long-term separation from the neighbouring populations researchers expected them to resemble. But their daily lives show contact with a much wider world. They were genetically distinctive, culturally they were connected. And that distinction matters because it challenges one of the simplest, most tempting stories we tell about the past. If a new crop appears, new people must have arrived. If a new technology appears, it must mean migration. If a community looks culturally similar to another community, they must be biologically related. Sometimes that happens. Human migration has absolutely carried languages, animals, crops, and genes across continents. But not always. Ideas can move without whole populations moving with them. A farmer can trade seeds with a herder. A traveller can teach a family how to ferment milk. A marriage alliance can introduce new recipes, new fabrics, new rituals, new animals, new words. A few visiting specialists can transform a community's technology without replacing that community's ancestry. Culture is portable. Genes are not quite so portable. To change the genetic profile of an entire population, you usually need sustained reproduction across generations. People have to arrive, settle, marry, have children, and leave a measurable biological signature in the descendants. But to spread an idea, you may only need one conversation, one exchange, one successful experiment. Picture a small oasis community in the Tarim Basin around 4,000 years ago. Their world is harsh, but it is not empty. Beyond the reeds and river channels lies the open desert. To the north are grasslands and the Dzungarian Basin. Beyond those are the vast steppe corridors of Inner Asia. To the west rise the Pamirs and the mountain routes leading toward Central Asia. To the south, difficult passes connect toward the Tibetan Plateau and the edges of South Asia. To the east are the routes that eventually lead toward the Hexi Corridor and the early states of northern China. The Tarim Basin looked isolated on a map, but maps can be deceptive. It was not a blank space. It was a network of river-fed oases around a massive desert. Anyone crossing the broader region did not march straight through the Taklamakan. They moved around it. They followed mountain foothills, river valleys, seasonal pastures, and chains of habitable settlements. The desert was a barrier, but its edges could also become corridors. That is where goods, animals, skills and stories may have moved. Not necessarily in one giant migration, not necessarily through a single conquering people, more likely through countless small encounters repeated over generations. Herders moving between summer and winter pastures. Traders carrying stone, metal, wool, hides, salt and food. Families arranging marriages between communities. Travellers stopping at oases where water was available and news was valuable. A bag of wheat can cross a continent without the farmer who first grew it ever leaving home. A herd of sheep can be acquired through trade, raiding bride wealth or exchange. A dairy tradition can spread because people see that milk can be turned into food that lasts longer, travels farther, and provides calories when crops fail. And in the Tarim Basin, dairy was not some vague possibility. Residue and protein evidence from ancient dental calculus has shown that some Bronze Age individuals consumed milk products from animals, including cattle, sheep, and goats. That is a remarkably intimate clue. Not a distant trade good found in a storage pit. Not an imported object buried with the dead. Evidence of food passing through people's mouths. These communities were participating in the pastoral world of Bronze Age Inner Asia. But participation did not mean replacement. That is the key. The 2021 Genome Study found that the earliest sampled Tarim Basin individuals did not show the substantial genetic input from Western steppe herders that many researchers might have predicted from their sheep, cattle, wheat and dairy practices. Nor did they simply resemble the nearby populations of the Dzungarian Basin, where genetic evidence does show stronger mixture involving steppe-related groups and populations from farther east. Same broad region, some overlapping ways of life, very different population histories. It is like finding two villages using similar tools, eating similar food, and wearing similar fabrics, then discovering that their grandparents came from entirely different family lines. That should not surprise us as much as it does. Look at the modern world. Coffee began in northeast Africa and Yemen, but people drink it in Tokyo, Mexico City, Istanbul and New York. Potatoes originated in the Andes, but they became central to diets in Ireland, India, China and Eastern Europe. The spread of a food does not mean everyone who eats it shares the ancestry of the people who first cultivated it. Bronze Age Eurasia worked on the same basic principle, just slower. Knowledge travelled along human relationships, and the Tarim communities were clearly capable of absorbing that knowledge while maintaining a distinct genetic identity. That does not mean they were closed to outsiders. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. They may have been highly selective participants in regional exchange. They could adopt animals that made sense in an arid environment. They could cultivate crops suited to oasis agriculture. They could incorporate dairy into their diet. They could share technologies with neighbouring pastoralists and farming communities. But cultural adoption does not require a population to disappear into its neighbours. A community can borrow without becoming someone else. That may be exactly what happened here. The early Tarim people seem to have preserved a deep ancestry that had become rare elsewhere, while building a practical, outward-looking culture shaped by contact across Inner Asia. Their identity was not a museum piece sealed beneath the sand. It was a living response to one of the hardest environments on Earth. They took what worked, they adapted it, they made it their own. And this is why the mummies matter far beyond Xinjiang. They force us to separate two questions that are often treated as one. Where did these people's ancestors come from? And where did these people's ideas come from? Those answers can overlap, but they do not have to. In the Tarim Basin, they clearly did not line up in the simple way archaeologists once expected. And just north of the desert, in the Dzungarian Basin, Another population was telling a very different story, one shaped by steppe herders, migration, and genetic mixture. Just north of the Tarim Basin, beyond the Tian Shan Mountains, lies the Dzungarian Basin. At first glance, it seems like part of the same world. Another enormous basin, another harsh inland landscape. Another place where mountains, grasslands, deserts and river valleys meet. If the Tarim Basin was the southern side of Xinjiang's prehistoric story, Dzungaria was the northern side. But genetically, the people buried there were telling a different story. This is where the simple idea of one ancient Xinjiang population completely falls apart. The Tarim Basin mummies, especially the earliest individuals sampled, carried ancestry that was overwhelmingly connected to ancient North Eurasians. They were descendants of a deep population lineage that had become rare or transformed almost everywhere else. But Bronze Age groups in Dzungaria show more evidence of mixture. Their genomes reflect connections to populations moving across the Eurasian steppe, along with ancestry related to groups farther east in Inner Asia. In some cases, they resemble or show links to the Western steppe pastoralists who had spread rapidly across huge distances during the Bronze Age. Same broad region, different genetic histories, and that difference is not a technical detail buried in a lab report. It changes how we imagine prehistoric Xinjiang. Picture the geography. To the north of Dzungaria stretch the great grasslands of Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and southern Siberia. This was steppe country, open land, seasonal pastures. Long horizons, a world where herding communities could move with sheep, goats, cattle and horses across distances that would be almost impossible for settled farming populations. For thousands of years, these grasslands acted like a giant connective tissue across Eurasia. Not an empty highway, not a straight line people marched along. The steppe was full of different communities, languages, rivalries, alliances, and local traditions. But it allowed movement. Herding economies were built around movement. Families followed pasture. Animals needed fresh grass. Trade followed herders. Marriages linked camps. New metalworking techniques, new animals, new weapons, and new customs could spread astonishingly far. And by the Bronze Age, pastoralist populations from the western steppe had expanded eastward into parts of Central Asia and southern Siberia. One of the archaeological cultures often discussed in this context is the Afanasievo culture. These were early Bronze Age pastoralists whose material traditions and genetic profile show strong links to populations from the western steppe. Their presence far to the east is one of the clearest signs that Inner Asia was already connected across incredible distances more than 4,000 years ago. Some early Dzungarian individuals show genetic links consistent with that wider steppe world. Later groups show something even more revealing. They were mixed. Not mixed in some vague metaphorical sense, mixed in their ancestry. Their DNA suggests that people from different population backgrounds met, formed families, and produced descendants in this northern zone. Steppe-related ancestry appears alongside ancestry associated with Eastern Inner Asian populations. In some cases, there are also signs of interaction with populations closer to the Tarim Basin. This is what migration looks like when you zoom in close enough. Not one people replacing another overnight. Not a clean arrow on a map labelled invasion. It is generations of contact. A herding camp arrives from the northwest. A local community already knows the valleys and water sources. Animals are traded, marriages happen, children grow up speaking more than one language or using customs inherited from both sides of their family. A new burial practice appears. A metal object changes hands. A herd becomes larger. A settlement adopts new food ways. Then, centuries later, geneticists extract DNA from a tooth, and find the record of all those human relationships still written inside it. Dzungaria was not genetically isolated in the way the early Tarim Basin appears to have been. It was more exposed to the steppe corridors, and that makes geographic sense. The northern basin opened toward the grasslands. Its roots connected more directly to the Altai region, to Kazakhstan, to Mongolia, and to the networks of mobile pastoralists moving across Inner Asia. The Tarim Basin, by contrast, was hemmed in by some of the most formidable terrain on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert dominated its centre. The Tian Shan rose to the north. The Kunlun Mountains rose to the south. Survival depended on particular river-fed oases along the edges. Those landscapes did not create a single wall, they created filters. A mountain pass might allow a few travellers through in summer, then become nearly impassable in winter. A pasture corridor could connect herding groups for generations. A desert crossing could be deadly without local knowledge. An oasis might become a meeting point, a trading station, a marriage network, or a refuge during drought. So the map of ancient Xinjiang was not divided into connected places and isolated places. It was a patchwork. Some valleys were deeply tied into steppe movements. Some oasis communities were connected through trade, but remained genetically distinct. Some regions may have received newcomers repeatedly. Others may have exchanged goods and ideas while absorbing very few outsiders into the local population. This is why the Tarim Basin result was so surprising. The early Tarim people were not simply the southern branch of the mixed populations to their north. They did not just look like Dzungarians who had crossed the mountains. Their ancestry was different enough to show that neighbouring basins could preserve radically different population histories. And yet they were not strangers to the same wider world. The people of Dzungaria and the Tarim Basin could have known related herding practices. They could have exchanged animals, crops, textiles, metals, and knowledge. They may have encountered each other along mountain foothills and oasis routes. But contact does not erase every boundary. Sometimes it creates a mosaic instead. That is the real prehistoric landscape of Inner Asia. Not a single race moving across a blank continent. Not separate worlds with no contact. A shifting network of communities. Herders on the grasslands. Farmers and herders at the foothills. Oasis settlements around desert margins. Mountain travellers carrying goods through narrow passes. Populations mixing heavily in one zone, remaining distinctive in another, and constantly adapting to the opportunities and dangers of the land. The Tarim mummies belong inside that larger story. They were not aliens in a desert. They were one unusually preserved branch of a much wider human world, surrounded by movement, exchange, and changing populations, while somehow holding on to a genetic inheritance that their neighbours did not share. And their bones hold more than the story of where their ancestors came from. They also preserve clues about how these people lived, what they ate, how healthy they were, and how closely the dead in these remarkable cemeteries may have been related. A genome can tell you about deep ancestry, but a body tells you something more immediate. It can tell you about hunger, work, injury, infection, childhood stress, the food someone chewed day after day, the people they may have grown up beside. Sometimes, if preservation is extraordinary, it can even preserve hair, skin, clothing, and the shape of a face that has not been seen for 4,000 years. That is what makes the Tarim mummies so powerful. They are not just ancient DNA samples from an argument about migration. They were people with worn teeth, aching joints, meals, families, beliefs, and bodies shaped by life at the edge of one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Start with the teeth. Teeth are among the toughest parts of the human body. Long after skin, organs, and muscle disappear, enamel can survive, and enamel records a lifetime of use. Heavy wear can suggest a diet containing tough, gritty, or fibrous foods. Cavities can reveal repeated exposure to carbohydrates. Microscopic damage may show whether people use their teeth for more than eating, perhaps gripping fibers, leather, sinew, or other materials while working. But teeth can also preserve something even more surprising. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up near the gums, can trap tiny traces of what passed through a person's mouth. Food particles, plant remains, microbes, sometimes proteins. In the Tarim Basin, chemical and proteomic evidence has helped confirm that dairy foods were part of life for some Bronze Age communities. Proteins associated with milk have been recovered from ancient dental calculus, offering direct evidence that these people consumed dairy products. That matters because the basin was not a place where survival came easily. A river-fed oasis might support crops. The surrounding land could support grazing animals. But neither source alone guaranteed security. Herding offered meat, milk, wool, hides, and mobility. Farming, where conditions allowed it, added grains and other plant foods. Wild resources may have supplemented both. The result was probably not one single Tarim diet. It was a flexible survival strategy, and flexibility leaves marks on bodies. Bones sometimes preserve evidence of nutritional stress, especially when it occurred during childhood. Growth can be disrupted by illness, famine, repeated infection, or seasonal shortages. Certain changes in teeth and bones may suggest that a person faced hardship while developing. But this is where caution matters. A line on a tooth is not a diary entry. A lesion on a bone does not automatically tell us the exact disease that caused it. Not every nutritional problem leaves visible skeletal evidence. And the people whose bodies survived may not represent everyone who lived in their communities. Infants, the elderly, travellers, people buried elsewhere, and those whose graves were destroyed may be missing from the record. Exceptional preservation can feel like a complete biography. It is not. It gives archaeologists an astonishing amount of evidence. But even a perfectly preserved face cannot tell us what that person feared, who they loved, or what language they spoke on an ordinary morning. The dead can answer some questions with incredible clarity. Others remain permanently beyond reach. Still, the clues add up. The Tarim mummies lived in communities where physical labour was unavoidable. Herding animals meant walking long distances, managing livestock, carrying supplies, processing wool and hides, preparing food, maintaining shelters, and adapting constantly to weather and water. Agricultural work, when practiced, brought its own demands. Planting, harvesting, grinding grain, hauling water, repairing irrigation channels, and protecting precious crops from drought. Skeletal wear can sometimes be consistent with repeated physical strain. Arthritis-like changes in joints, muscle attachment patterns, spinal degeneration, and healed injuries may all hint at a difficult life. But they cannot be translated too neatly. A strong shoulder does not prove one specific task. A damaged knee does not tell us whether someone fell, rode, carried loads, or simply aged in a physically demanding world. And age itself is difficult to read. Archaeologists can estimate broad age ranges from teeth, bones, and skeletal development. They can identify children, adolescents, younger adults, and people who lived into later adulthood. But ancient age estimates are rarely precise. We cannot look at a mummy and confidently say they were exactly 37 years old, or that they died from one particular illness. What we can say is that some individuals survived long enough to accumulate the marks of years of work and stress. That alone matters. In a landscape of desert margins, cold winters, uncertain water, and limited medical care, reaching mature adulthood was not guaranteed. Every older person in a cemetery represents experience that had made it through years of risk. Then there are the smaller inhabitants of this ancient world. Hair can sometimes preserve evidence of grooming, dyes, and even parasites. Lice and their eggs may survive in archaeological contexts, reminding us that ancient life was not a clean museum display. Parasites found in preserved waste or latrine deposits can reveal exposure to contaminated water, animals, or food. These traces help reconstruct the disease environment people lived with. But once again, absence is not proof of health. If archaeologists do not find evidence of a parasite, that may mean it was not present, or it may mean it did not preserve. If no disease lesion appears on a skeleton, that does not mean the person was disease-free. Many lethal illnesses leave no recognizable mark on bone at all. The evidence is fragmentary, but it is human fragmentary evidence, and DNA has added another layer to that human story. At some Tarim Basin cemeteries, genetic analysis suggests that individuals buried in the same place were not random strangers. They belonged to communities with real biological connections, though the exact nature of those connections varies from site to site and remains limited by how many people have been sampled. At Xiaohe, in particular, the genetic picture points to a remarkably homogeneous community. The people tested shared a closely related ancestry profile consistent with a population that had remained relatively isolated over many generations. That does not mean every person in the cemetery was an immediate relative. A cemetery can serve a village, several camps, or a wider social network over centuries. But it does suggest continuity. These graves were likely not filled by unrelated travellers who happened to die in the same desert. They belonged to people embedded in an enduring community, and burial itself tells us something about that community. At Xiaohe, the dead were placed in distinctive wooden coffins, often described as boat-shaped, beneath rows of tall wooden markers. The cemetery was carefully organised. Burials followed recognisable rituals. Objects were placed with the dead. The treatment of men, women, and children could differ in meaningful ways. These patterns tell us that death was not handled casually. The living returned to this place. They remembered where the dead belonged. They invested labour in coffins, markers, and grave goods. They maintained traditions strong enough to survive across generations. But burial position is not a transparent window into belief. A body laid facing one direction may reflect ritual, status, family custom, practical constraints, or a tradition whose meaning is now lost. A grave object may have belonged to the dead person, or it may have been chosen by those mourning them. Archaeologists can identify patterns. The deeper symbolism often remains uncertain. That uncertainty should not make the mummies less meaningful. It should make us more careful. For decades, the Tarim mummies were treated mainly as evidence in a giant argument. Were they European? Were they migrants? Were they connected to one language family or another? Their faces became exhibits. Their ancestry became a political and historical puzzle. But look closer. There was a child buried in this cemetery, an adult whose teeth carried the record of meals eaten long ago. Someone whose hair survived the centuries, someone whose joints may have ached after years of work, someone placed carefully into the ground by people who knew exactly what that burial meant. Their DNA changed the story of ancient Xinjiang. Their bodies bring us back to something even more important. They were not a mystery first. They were people. They were people. And they lived thousands of years before the name Silk Road meant anything at all. That distinction changes the entire story. When most people hear Xinjiang, they imagine caravans, camels crossing dunes, silk moving west toward Rome, horses, jade, spices, glass, gold, Buddhist monks, imperial envoys, merchants speaking languages from every corner of Eurasia. That world was real. But it came later. The earliest Tarim Basin mummies, including many of the famous burials at Xiaohe and the surrounding desert oases, belong mainly to the Bronze Age. Some are roughly 4,000 years old. The great overland trade networks, usually called the Silk Road, developed over a much longer period, becoming especially important from around the last centuries before the Common Era and expanding dramatically under the Han dynasty. In other words, there is a gap of well over 1,000 years between the earliest Tarim communities and the age of the great caravans. The people in those boat-shaped coffins were not Silk Road merchants waiting for history to begin. They were living in an older Xinjiang, a Xinjiang of river channels, pasture, small farming communities, desert margins, local burial grounds, and cultural traditions that had developed under conditions of extraordinary isolation. But isolation never meant permanent separation. The Tarim Basin sits inside one of the most important crossroads on Earth. To the north lay the Dzungarian Basin and the open grasslands of Inner Asia. To the west stood the mountain routes leading towards Central Asia. To the south were the Kunlun Mountains and the high plateau beyond them. To the east lay the corridor connecting toward the heartlands of early Chinese states. For millennia, these routes were difficult, they were dangerous. But they were never impossible. People moved through them in waves. Some came as herders, some as traders, some as soldiers, settlers, refugees, monks, officials, prisoners, brides and families searching for land or safety. Some stayed, some mixed with local populations, some disappeared from the historical record almost as quickly as they arrived. By the first millennium BCE, the human map of Xinjiang was already becoming far more complicated than the map of the Bronze Age. Pastoral groups connected to the wider steppe world moved across and around the region. Among them were populations often associated in historical sources with the Saka, Iranian-speaking peoples whose cultural connections extended across Central Asia. In oasis settlements around the Tarim Basin, languages related to the Indo-European family later appeared in written form, including the now extinct Tocharian languages. Then came expanding empires. The Han dynasty pushed westward in the 2nd century BCE, driven partly by diplomacy, military rivalry, and the urgent search for powerful horses from Central Asia. Han envoys and armies entered a world that was already politically diverse. They did not discover an empty desert. They encountered oasis kingdoms, local rulers, competing alliances, and communities with their own histories. The routes that linked these places became increasingly important. Silk travelled west, horses travelled east, so did jade, textiles, metalwork, grapes, grain, medicines, artistic styles, religious ideas and stories. Roman glass has been found far from Rome. Chinese silk turned up far beyond China. Indian Buddhist texts and images moved through oasis towns. Central Asian merchants carried goods and languages across immense distances. And the Silk Road was never really one road. It was a shifting network. A route could flourish for a generation, then vanish when a river changed course, a kingdom collapsed, a pass became dangerous, or a new empire redirected trade elsewhere. Oases that looked permanent on a map could be abandoned when water failed. A town that controlled one caravan route could become irrelevant when another opened. The desert did not freeze history in place, it kept moving. That matters when people try to draw a straight line from a 4,000-year-old mummy to a modern identity. It is understandable to want that line. Ancient remains can feel like proof of belonging. They can seem to offer a simple answer to an emotionally powerful question. Who was here first? But the evidence does not offer simplicity. Between the Bronze Age Tarim communities and the present day lie thousands of years of migration, intermarriage, conquest, trade, language shift, religious change, population decline, population growth, and political transformation. Saka-related groups, Han settlers and officials, Kushan-era networks from farther west and south, Sogdian merchants, Xiongnu and other steppe confederations, Turkic-speaking peoples, Tibetan influence, Mongol expansion, and many more historical forces all shaped the region. No single group remained unchanged through all of that. No culture stood still, and no modern community can be reduced to one ancient cemetery. The Tarim mummies are still deeply important to the history of Xinjiang. They reveal that the region's past was already rich and distinctive long before imperial records, before Buddhist cave temples, before caravan cities, before silk became the symbol of Eurasian exchange. They show that ancient people built enduring communities in places outsiders might assume were uninhabitable. They adapted to drylands. They herded animals, used dairy foods, buried their dead with care, maintained traditions, and created material cultures that were both local and connected to wider worlds. Their ancestry also reminds us that connection does not always mean recent migration. The early Tarim people had deep roots linked to ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Yet their culture included practices and materials connected to neighbouring regions. They could be genetically isolated in important ways while still participating in exchanges of knowledge, animals, crops, technologies, and ideas. That combination is not a contradiction. It is what human history usually looks like. People can preserve a strong local identity while adopting useful things from their neighbours. They can marry mostly within their own community while trading over long distances. They can speak one language, wear borrowed styles, eat foods introduced from elsewhere, and still see themselves as belonging to a place their ancestors have occupied for generations. The Silk Road made that truth impossible to ignore. Over time, Xinjiang became one of the great meeting places of Eurasia, not a blank corridor between civilizations, but a world of its own. A place where civilizations met, yes, but also where local communities made choices, built towns, translated texts, raised children, governed oases, and transformed everything that passed through. The mummies belong to the beginning of that long story. Not the beginning of every people who would later live in Xinjiang. Not proof that one modern identity owns the entire past. But evidence that the region has always contained more history than any single narrative can hold. And that may be the real lesson of the Tarim Basin. The desert preserved faces from a vanished Bronze Age world. But it did not preserve a frozen world. Around those ancient graves, century after century, new people arrived. New languages were spoken. New gods were worshipped. New roads crossed the sand. The mystery was never locked in the past. It was part of a living crossroads, and that is exactly why the debate is not over. The 2021 Genome Study answered one huge question. The earliest studied Tarim Basin people were not simply recent migrants from the West. They were not a lost colony of Bronze Age Europeans. They were not genetically identical to the pastoralists of the steppe. Their ancestry was deeply rooted in an ancient northern Eurasian population that had survived in fragments long after most of its relatives had disappeared. But answering one question created several new ones. The biggest is also the simplest. How did their ancestors actually get into the Tarim Basin? The genomes tell us that the early Tarim population had a distinctive ancestry profile, but DNA does not come with a map. It cannot point to one mountain pass and say they crossed here. It cannot tell us whether their ancestors entered from the north through the Dzungarian Basin, from the west through Central Asia, from the east along the edges of the Gobi, or through some route that no longer exists because rivers changed course and deserts swallowed the evidence. And the answer may not be one route. Ancient populations rarely move in a single clean line. Small groups split. Some turn back, some settle beside a river for generations. Some join another community, some disappear, A population that appears isolated in the genetic record may have reached its destination through a long chain of movements, pauses, and local relationships that are now invisible to us. The earliest Tarim people may have descended from groups already living near the basin's northern or eastern margins, or their ancestors may have come through places where no ancient DNA has yet been recovered. There are vast regions of Inner Asia with almost no genetic record from the relevant periods. That matters, because when scientists say the Tarim mummies do not closely match any known ancient population, the key word is known. Known does not mean that no such population ever existed. It means no sampled population has yet provided the missing link. Imagine trying to reconstruct an entire family tree from a few photographs found in different houses. You might identify grandparents, cousins, and distant relatives. But if one branch of the family left no photographs at all, you could mistake that missing branch for a mystery with no connection to anyone else. Ancient DNA works the same way. Every new burial sampled has the potential to change the map. A future genome from an unsampled valley in Mongolia, southern Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Gansu Corridor, or the mountain zones around the Tarim Basin could reveal a population genetically close to the people buried at Xiaohe. It could show that the Tarim communities had neighbours we have not yet recognised, or it could confirm that their isolation was even more profound than researchers currently think. That is not a weakness of the science. That is how science is supposed to work. A conclusion becomes stronger when it survives new evidence. And sometimes new evidence forces researchers to redraw the whole picture. Language remains another enormous unknown. The Tarim mummies did not leave written records from their earliest period. No letters, no royal inscriptions, no dictionary carved into stone telling us what they called themselves, what words they used for the desert, or what stories they told around their fires. Much later, written languages appeared in the Tarim Basin, including Tocharian languages in some oasis communities. Because Tocharian belongs to the Indo-European language family, people once tried to connect those later texts directly to the fair-haired, European-looking mummies. But appearance, language, and ancestry do not move together in neat packages. A community can adopt a new language without a large-scale replacement of its population. A language can spread through trade, marriage, religion, political power, or prestige, and a genetically distinct population can speak a language shared by its neighbours. So what did the Bronze Age Tarim people speak? The honest answer is, we do not know. They may have spoken a language that vanished completely. They may have spoken several languages across different settlements. Their speech could have belonged to a family now extinct, or it may have been distantly related to languages that later spread across Inner Asia. Until direct evidence appears, every specific answer remains speculation. The same uncertainty surrounds their social world. The boat-shaped coffins at Xiaohe, the wooden posts rising from the cemetery, the careful placement of grave goods, the cattle imagery, the dairy residues, the repeated burial patterns, all of this tells us that ritual mattered. But what did the rituals mean? Were the posts symbols of ancestors, clan identity, fertility, status, gender, or something else entirely? Did the cemetery unite several scattered communities? Was it a place used by one lineage over generations? Did every person receive the same treatment? Or were important differences hidden in details archaeologists are still learning to read? Objects can survive for 4,000 years. Intentions usually do not. A leather cap, a woven textile, a carved wooden marker, a piece of cheese placed beside the dead. Each one is evidence. But none arrives with an explanation attached. Archaeologists have to compare patterns, test materials, study placement, and consider possibilities without turning possibility into certainty. Even the question of cultural transmission remains open. The Tarim people used crops, animals, and technologies with connections beyond the basin. Wheat and barley had long histories farther west. Millets linked toward eastern regions. Herding traditions reflected broader Eurasian developments. Yet, the early Tarim population itself showed limited genetic mixing with many of the groups associated with those cultural practices. So how did the knowledge move? Through trade? Through a few travelling specialists? Through marriages that left little detectable genetic signal? Through neighbouring communities passing along seeds, animals, techniques and ideas one generation at a time? We know culture can travel without entire populations moving. The Tarim Basin may be one of the clearest ancient examples of that truth, but the precise mechanisms are still being worked out. And there is another debate that is not only scientific. It is ethical. These were not artifacts in the ordinary sense. They were human beings whose bodies survived because the desert happened to preserve them. That creates difficult questions. When should remains be excavated? When should they be left untouched? How should they be stored, studied, displayed, or photographed? Who should help decide how they are interpreted? How do museums teach the public about ancient people without turning their faces into spectacle? The preservation of the mummies is extraordinary, but preservation is fragile. Exposure to air, shifting humidity, light, microbes and careless handling can damage remains that endured untouched for millennia. Every decision to excavate can reveal new evidence. It can also destroy the original context forever, and interpretation carries its own risks. The Tarim mummies have been pulled into arguments about ancestry, nationality, race, territory, and identity. Their faces have been used to support stories that are far more certain than the evidence allows. But ancient DNA cannot tell us who has the right to claim a landscape today. It cannot reduce the history of Xinjiang to a contest over who arrived first. It can only offer one kind of evidence about people who lived in a very different world. Still, the tools keep improving. Proteomics, the study of ancient proteins, can identify traces of milk, meat, plants, pathogens, and even biological materials too degraded for DNA analysis. Isotope studies can reveal what people ate, whether they moved between regions, what water they drank, and how animals were raised. Environmental archaeology can reconstruct ancient river systems, pollen, seeds, parasites, dung, and changing climates, helping explain where people could live and how they survived. A tiny protein trapped in dental calculus may reveal a meal. A chemical signature in a tooth may reveal a childhood spent far from the place of burial. A buried grain, a fragment of wool, or a change in ancient lake sediments may transform what we think we know about the desert itself. So the Tarim mummies are not a solved mystery. They are a mystery becoming more precise. The more we learn, the less useful the old simple stories become. Not invaders from one direction, not a people outside history, not a frozen image of a vanished race. They were communities making lives at the edge of one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. And the unanswered questions do not make them less real. They make them more human. That may be the most important lesson of all. The Tarim mummies began as a shock, bodies emerging from desert sands with faces so well preserved they seemed almost recent. Wool clothes, felt hats, leather boots, wooden markers standing over boat-shaped coffins, cheese placed beside the dead, a cemetery built in a place that now looks almost impossible for human life. And then came the arguments. Their appearance encouraged people to tell a simple story. They must have come from Europe. Their textiles looked Western. Their cattle and crops had connections beyond the basin. Later, Indo-European languages appeared in parts of the region. So surely the answer was migration. A whole people moving east across the steppe and vanishing into the desert. But the genomes complicated that story. The earliest studied Tarim people were not genetically without precedent, not visitors from nowhere, and not a perfect match for any living population. They represented an unusually isolated branch, with deep ancestry linked to ancient North Eurasians, a population known from much older remains across northern Eurasia. That is still extraordinary. It means that a genetic heritage which survived elsewhere only in fragments remained unusually concentrated among people living in the Tarim Basin thousands of years later. But it does not mean they were cut off from the world in every sense. Their food, animals, crops, textiles, and technologies show contact, exchange, and adaptation. Ideas could cross mountains and deserts. Seeds could move. Herding practices could spread. Materials and skills could pass from one community to another without a massive migration, replacing everyone already there. That is the difference between a mystery and a myth. A mystery is a question supported by evidence, with room for new answers. A myth is what happens when uncertainty gets filled with confidence before the evidence is ready. Headlines love phrases like DNA matched no known population on Earth, and technically that captures part of the surprise. But it can hide the more careful truth. No known close match is not the same as no ancestry. Isolation is not the same as total separation, and a striking face is not a map of where someone came from. The people of the Tarim Basin were not a riddle waiting to be reduced to one label. They were families, herders, craft workers, travellers perhaps, parents who buried their dead with care, communities that made a life beside ancient rivers while the desert pressed in around them. Future DNA from an unsampled valley may reveal their missing relatives. New excavations may clarify how they reached the basin. A forgotten inscription, buried settlement, or tiny protein preserved in a tooth may one day tell us what language they spoke, what they believed, and how far their connections truly reached. Until then, the mystery remains. Not less fascinating because it is complicated, but more human because it is. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us where you're listening from. The best way to support the channel is by listening on Spotify through the link in the description.